What your brain does while you dream. Something is going to happen to you tonight that happens to every human being who falls asleep, and that scientists have spent the better part of a century trying to understand. It will happen without your instruction or your permission. It will produce experiences more vivid and more strange than almost anything available in the waking world, experiences of flying, of conversations with people long dead, of rooms that shift into other rooms, of emotions so intense they wake you, of landscapes that are simultaneously familiar and impossible. It will do all of this while your body lies perfectly still, your muscles paralyzed by a dedicated neural mechanism designed precisely to prevent you from acting out what your mind is experiencing. And then, for most of you, it will leave almost no trace, the dream dissolving in the first minutes of waking as completely as if it had never been. The dream. The oldest mystery of the human mind, perhaps the oldest experience we have a word for, certainly among the most universal. Every culture that has ever existed has had something to say about dreaming, has interpreted it, feared it, sought it, recorded it, argued about it, built rituals around it. The ancient Egyptians believed that dreams were messages from the gods, and they built dream temples, incubation chambers where priests slept in hopes of receiving divine guidance. The ancient Greeks made the same assumption, dedicating sanctuaries to Asclepius where the sick would sleep in hopes of a healing vision. For most of human history, the dream was not a product of the mind but a visitation from something outside it. Tonight, as you lie here in the dark, the science of what actually happens inside the dreaming brain will unfold around you. Not to replace the mystery, but to deepen it, because what neuroscience has revealed about the sleeping mind is, if anything, stranger and more interesting than the divine origin theories it replaced. The brain during REM sleep is not a brain at rest. It is a brain more active, in some regions, than during focused waking thought. It is a brain performing tasks of extraordinary importance, replaying the day's experiences in compressed and creative form, reducing the emotional charge of difficult memories, constructing simulations of social situations, testing responses, weaving fragments of the past into something new. The dream is not a side effect of sleep. It is a reason for it. Over the course of the next few hours, you will hear about the architecture of sleep, the cycling of stages through the night, the different depths and qualities of rest. You will hear about what the dreaming brain looks like from the outside, through the lens of modern brain imaging, and about which regions ignite and which fall quiet when the dream begins. You will learn why your muscles are paralyzed while you dream and what happens in the rare cases when that paralysis fails. You will travel back through the history of dream science, from Sigmund Freud's interpretations to the landmark 1953 discovery in a sleep laboratory in Chicago that changed everything. You will consider whether animals dream and what the evidence suggests. And you will arrive, finally, at the threshold of sleep, the strange, shimmering country of hypnagogia, where the dream begins before you know it has begun. But the most important thing about this episode, on this night, is not any particular piece of information. It is the fact that you are already approaching the territory it describes. Even now, as you listen, your brain is doing some of what it will spend the night doing, down-regulating the prefrontal cortex, the region of executive control and self-monitoring. Allowing the default mode network, the brain's resting state, its dreaming infrastructure, to become more active. Beginning the slow withdrawal from the waking world into the interior. You do not need to do anything with this information. You do not need to try to dream, or to improve your dreaming, or to remember what you dreamed tonight. The brain will do what it does without any instruction from you. It has been doing it every night of your life, through infancy and childhood and every year since, refining and consolidating and processing and simulating, in the dark, in the quiet, while the body rested and the waking mind was absent. The science explored tonight is the science of something you are already doing, have always done, will do again in a few minutes or a few hours without any preparation or instruction. The brain does not require your understanding to dream. It does not require your permission or your involvement. It requires only that you sleep, that you allow the body to be still, the eyes to close, the thoughts to thin and drift, and it will handle everything else. The dreaming is not something you will do tonight. It is something that will happen to you, as it has always happened, in the dark, while you are entirely elsewhere. Let the brain do its work tonight. And let the listening carry you toward it. Chapter 1: The Architecture of Sleep. Sleep is not a single state. It is not simply the absence of waking, a blank, undifferentiated period of unconsciousness that begins when the eyes close and ends when the alarm sounds. Sleep has a structure. It has stages, each physiologically distinct, each serving different purposes, each recurring in a pattern that repeats across the night with the regularity of a slow biological clock. Understanding this structure is the first step to understanding the dream, because dreaming, the vivid, narrative, emotionally rich dreaming of REM sleep, does not occur uniformly throughout the night, but in concentrated bursts that become longer and richer as the hours pass, weighted toward the end of the sleep period in a way that means the dreaming brain is most active in the hour or two before you naturally wake. The structure of sleep was first mapped in detail in the 1950s, when the development of the electroencephalograph, the EEG, which measures the electrical activity of the brain through electrodes placed on the scalp, made it possible, for the first time, to observe the sleeping brain without disturbing the sleeper. What researchers found when they attached their electrodes and watched the ink traces through the night was not a steady, quiet hum of reduced activity, but a dynamic, oscillating pattern of distinct brain states, each with its own characteristic wave pattern, each transitioning into the next in a sequence that repeated throughout the night. The first stage of sleep is the lightest, stage 1 NREM, or non-rapid eye movement sleep, a transitional state between waking and sleeping that most people pass through in a few minutes, often without clearly perceiving the transition. The brain waves in stage 1 shift from the mixed, relatively fast frequencies of relaxed waking to slower, lower amplitude waves called theta waves, produced by the hippocampus and other brain regions, beginning their transition from active engagement with the world to the more interior processing of sleep. During stage 1, the eyes move slowly and irregularly behind closed lids, the muscles of the body relax in small jerks, the hypnic jerks that sometimes wake a person at the edge of sleep with a sudden sensation of falling, and awareness of the surrounding environment begins to fade. The brain is loosening its grip on the waking world. Stage 2 NREM is the next step down, and it constitutes the largest portion of a typical night's sleep, roughly half of the total. The EEG in stage 2 shows a characteristic pattern, a background of theta waves punctuated by bursts of rapid oscillation called sleep spindles, each lasting about a second and occurring perhaps 15 times per minute. Sleep spindles are produced by a circuit between the thalamus and the cortex, and current research suggests they play an important role in memory consolidation, particularly the consolidation of procedural memories, the learning of skills and sequences. They may also serve to protect the continuity of sleep, suppressing the processing of external sounds that might otherwise disturb it. Alongside the spindles appear K-complexes, large, sharp waves that serve as brief protective responses to external stimuli without requiring full waking. The brain in stage 2 is asleep, genuinely and deeply, but not yet at its deepest. Stage 3 NREM, slow-wave sleep, sometimes called deep sleep or delta sleep, is the most restorative phase of sleep in physiological terms. The EEG in slow-wave sleep shows large, slow waves of high amplitude called delta waves, occurring at frequencies of less than 4 cycles per second. These waves reflect a state of highly synchronized activity across vast regions of the cortex, neurons firing together in slow, sweeping patterns rather than the rapid, chaotic firing of waking. During slow-wave sleep, the growth hormone is released in its greatest concentrations of the day. The immune system is most active. Tissue repair proceeds at its highest rate. The glymphatic system, discussed in earlier episodes, performs its clearing of metabolic waste from the brain with greatest efficiency. The body is at its most thoroughly restored. And dreams, if they occur at all in slow-wave sleep, are typically vague and thought-like, more resemblance to rumination or repetitive thought than to the vivid narrative experiences of REM. REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, is the fourth and final state, the dreaming state, the state that has most captured the imagination of researchers and of anyone who has woken from a powerful dream and lain in the dark, wondering. In REM, the EEG looks paradoxically like the waking brain, a pattern of relatively fast, desynchronized waves, the cortex buzzing with activity, the sleeper appearing, to the EEG at least, more awake than asleep. The eyes move rapidly beneath the closed lids in bursts that gave the stage its name. The muscles are paralyzed. The heart rate and breathing become irregular, varying in response to the dream content in ways that mirror what would happen if the dreamed experiences were real. The brain is generating an entire vivid world from within, and the body is along for the ride. A single sleep cycle, progressing from stage 1 through stage 2, stage 3, and then REM, lasts approximately 90 minutes. A typical night of sleep contains 4 to 6 of these cycles. But the cycles are not all equal. In the early part of the night, the cycles are weighted towards slow-wave sleep. The first 2 cycles may contain substantial amounts of stage 3, with relatively brief REM periods. As the night progresses, the slow-wave sleep diminishes and the REM periods lengthen. By the 4th and 5th cycles, in the early morning hours, the cycle may consist almost entirely of stage 2 and REM, with little or no slow-wave sleep. This means that a person who sleeps 7 hours experiences most of their deep, restorative slow-wave sleep in the first half of the night, and most of their vivid dreaming in the second half, and a person who cuts their sleep by 2 hours loses not 7/7 of their sleep equally, but disproportionately their REM sleep, the dreaming hours, the hours in which the brain is doing some of its most specific and important work. The architecture is precise, and it is purposeful. Each stage serves specific functions. Each transition is managed by a complex interplay of neurotransmitters, hormones, and neural circuits, the monoaminergic system, norepinephrine, serotonin, histamine, active in waking and suppressed in sleep, the cholinergic system active in REM, the adenosine system building sleep pressure over the waking day and being cleared by sleep. The brain does not simply turn off at night. It reorganizes. It shifts between modes. It moves through a carefully orchestrated sequence of states, each one doing something the others cannot, each one necessary for what follows. The pressure to sleep, the physiological drive that accumulates with every hour of wakefulness and is relieved only by sleep, is mediated primarily by a molecule called adenosine. Adenosine is a byproduct of cellular energy consumption in the brain. The more metabolically active the brain is, the more adenosine accumulates in the extracellular fluid surrounding the neurons. Specialized receptors on neurons throughout the brain detect the rising adenosine concentration, and their activation produces a progressive slowing of neural activity, a reduction in alertness, and a growing subjective sense of sleepiness. After approximately 16 hours of continuous wakefulness, adenosine levels are high enough to produce the irresistible sleepiness of a late evening. After a night of sleep, adenosine has been cleared, broken down by adenosine deaminase, and waking begins with the brain's adenosine system reset, the slate wiped. Caffeine works precisely by blocking the adenosine receptors. It does not reduce the adenosine itself, which continues to accumulate, but prevents the brain from detecting it. The drowsiness that caffeine suppresses returns, often suddenly, when the caffeine is metabolized and the accumulated adenosine finally reaches the blocked receptors at once. The sleep pressure system described by adenosine is one of 2 processes that together determine when and how deeply we sleep, a model proposed by the Swiss sleep researcher Alexander Borbely in 1982, known as the 2-process model of sleep regulation. The first process, process S, is the adenosine-driven homeostatic sleep pressure that rises with waking and falls with sleep. The second, process C, is the circadian rhythm, the approximately 24-hour biological clock, driven by the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus, that independently regulates the timing of sleepiness and alertness across the day. When the two processes align, when high sleep pressure coincides with the circadian signal for sleep, sleep comes easily and is deep. When they conflict, as in jet lag, shift work, or the deliberate extension of wakefulness, the resulting sleep is often lighter, more fragmented, and less restorative. Individual differences in sleep timing, the distinction between morning larks and evening owls, the chronotypes that determine when the circadian system peaks and when it declines, reflect genuine differences in the biological clock rather than mere preference or laziness. Chronotype is partly heritable, partly developmental. Teenagers shift dramatically toward later timing during puberty, under hormonal influence, and then shift gradually back toward earlier timing across adulthood and into old age. An evening chronotype, a natural night owl, is not simply someone who has chosen to stay up late. Their circadian system genuinely peaks later, melatonin rises later, and the biological pressure to sleep arrives later than in a morning type. Forcing a night owl to conform to a morning schedule is, in a physiological sense, asking them to live permanently jet-lagged. Sleep architecture changes substantially across the lifespan. Newborn infants spend approximately half of their sleep time, which can total 16 to 18 hours per day, in REM sleep. The proportion of REM declines through infancy and childhood, reaching the adult level of approximately 20 to 25% by early adolescence. In older adults, slow-wave sleep decreases significantly, the delta waves become smaller and less frequent, and stage 3 sleep may be largely absent by the 7th or 8th decade. REM sleep decreases somewhat but remains more robust than slow-wave sleep. The consequence of this architectural change in aging is a lighter, more fragmented sleep, more easily disrupted by noise, temperature, and the need to urinate, more prone to early waking, less restorative in terms of the physical repair that slow-wave sleep provides. The stability of the sleep cycle, the approximately 90-minute rhythm that repeats through the night, is itself a remarkable feature of sleep regulation. This rhythm, called the ultradian rhythm of sleep, appears to be driven by an oscillator in the brainstem that alternates between NREM-promoting and REM-promoting states on a roughly 90-minute cycle. The same oscillator, or a closely related one, may drive the alternation between different modes of resting wakefulness, the tendency of the mind to shift between focused and diffuse modes of thought approximately every 90 minutes during the day. The day and the night are not as different as they seem. The same slow biological rhythms thread through both. What you enter tonight, as the eyes close and the day recedes, is not a void. It is a structured, purposeful progression through states that the brain has evolved over hundreds of millions of years to enter in this order, at this depth, for these reasons. The structure is yours, adjusted by your chronotype, your age, your health, your recent sleep history, but it follows the ancient pattern. And at the end of it, as the night deepens and the cycles turn, the dreaming is waiting. You are somewhere in this architecture right now. Moving, slowly, toward the dreaming. Chapter 2, The Dreaming Brain. If you could look inside the dreaming brain, not as a thought experiment, but with the actual tools of modern neuroscience, the functional MRI scanners and the EEG arrays and the neural recording equipment that researchers use to peer into sleeping subjects in laboratories around the world, you would see something that challenges every intuitive sense of what sleep is supposed to be. You would expect to see a quiet brain, a dim brain, a brain in which activity is reduced across the board as it settles into a passive rest. Instead, in REM sleep, you would see something closer to the opposite, a brain blazing with activity in regions that are as active as they ever are, brighter in the scanner than many waking states, while other regions, specific, important, defining regions, have gone almost entirely dark. The regions that light up most vividly in the dreaming brain tell the story of what the dream is made of. The visual cortex, the large expanse of cortical tissue at the back of the brain devoted to the processing of visual information, is highly active in REM sleep, even though the eyes are closed and no light is reaching the retina. The brain is not waiting for visual input to process visual experience. It is generating visual experience from within, producing the images and scenes and faces and landscapes of the dream from its own internal activity, without any reference to the darkroom in which the body is lying. The dreaming brain sees without eyes. The visual cortex, which in waking life processes information arriving from the retina, in dreaming processes information arriving from the rest of the brain, from memory networks and emotional systems and the motor cortex, and it cannot tell the difference. The dream looks real because, to the visual cortex, it is. The limbic system, the collection of deep brain structures associated with emotion, particularly the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the anterior cingulate cortex, is extraordinarily active during REM sleep. The amygdala, sometimes characterized as the brain's threat detection and emotional response center, shows activity in REM that matches or exceeds its activity during intense emotional experiences in waking life. This is one of the reasons dreams feel so emotionally saturated. The amygdala is not a passenger in the dream, it is one of its primary architects, coloring the narrative with fear, with longing, with grief, with elation, generating emotional responses to imagined events that are physiologically real, the racing heart, the shallow breath, the skin response, even though the events themselves exist only in the sleeping mind. The motor cortex, which plans and initiates voluntary movement, is also active during REM sleep. The dreaming brain is generating motor programs, plans for moving, walking, running, reaching, that would produce real movement if the body were awake. That they do not produce movement is not because the motor cortex fails to generate the signals, but because those signals are blocked before they reach the muscles by a dedicated neural mechanism in the brainstem. But the planning, the intention, the simulation of movement, all of it is happening. The person who dreams of running is, in a neurologically meaningful sense, running. The motor cortex is running them. The regions that go dark in the dreaming brain are as informative as those that light up. The most significant deactivation occurs in the prefrontal cortex, specifically the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region most associated with executive function, logical reasoning, self-monitoring, and the critical evaluation of experience. This region, which in waking life allows us to ask whether something makes sense, to notice inconsistencies, to apply rational judgment to what we perceive, essentially goes offline in REM sleep. Its deactivation is profound and consistent, and it is almost certainly responsible for the most characteristic quality of the dream, the uncritical acceptance of the impossible. In a dream, you might find yourself in your childhood home, which is also somehow a school in a foreign country, with a ceiling that extends into open sky, speaking with a person who is simultaneously your mother and a colleague you have never met outside a professional context. None of this strikes you as strange. The prefrontal cortex, which would immediately flag these inconsistencies if you were awake, has gone quiet. The dream proceeds without its editorial voice. The deactivation of the prefrontal cortex also explains why it is so difficult to realize that you are dreaming while you are in the dream, a realization that requires exactly the kind of metacognitive awareness and self-referential thinking that the prefrontal cortex provides. The rare state of lucid dreaming, in which a dreamer becomes aware that they are dreaming while the dream continues, appears to involve a partial reactivation of the prefrontal cortex, a brief recovery of the monitoring function that the dream normally suppresses. We will return to this. The hippocampus, the brain's primary memory structure, the region that consolidates new experiences into long-term memory and retrieves them, shows a complex pattern of activity in sleep. During slow-wave sleep, it is highly active, replaying the patterns of neural activity associated with the day's experiences in a compressed, rapid form, a process called hippocampal replay or sharp-wave ripple replay, in which the events of the day are reactivated and potentially transferred to the cortex for long-term storage. During REM sleep, the hippocampus is somewhat less active, and the balance of activity shifts toward the cortex, where longer-term associative memory is stored. This two-stage memory consolidation process, hippocampal encoding during waking, hippocampal replay during slow-wave sleep, cortical integration during REM, is one of the most studied aspects of sleep function and one of the strongest arguments for why sleep deprivation impairs memory so severely. The cholinergic system is the key neurochemical driver of REM sleep. During waking and during NREM sleep, the monoaminergic neurotransmitters, serotonin, norepinephrine, histamine, are active and help maintain alertness and sensory processing. As REM sleep begins, these systems are suppressed, and acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter of the cholinergic system, rises dramatically. The acetylcholine drives the desynchronized, active EEG of REM, activates the visual cortex and limbic system, and appears to be directly responsible for the generation of the dream experience. Drugs that increase acetylcholine, including certain medications used in Alzheimer's disease, which enhance cholinergic function, often produce more vivid and intense dreams as a side effect. Drugs that block acetylcholine have the opposite effect, producing dreamless sleep. The dreaming brain is a brain in a very specific and unusual state, active where it is usually quiet, quiet where it is usually active, generating an entire world from within, believing what it generates without question, feeling what it imagines with the full physiological weight of real experience. The thalamus, the egg-shaped relay station at the center of the brain through which almost all sensory information passes on its way to the cortex, plays a crucial role in the transition between waking and dreaming. In waking life, the thalamus acts as a gatekeeper. It receives sensory signals from the eyes, ears, skin, and other sensory organs and forwards them to the appropriate cortical regions for processing. In slow-wave sleep, the thalamus effectively closes the gate. Its neurons shift into a mode of slow, rhythmic oscillation that prevents most incoming sensory information from reaching the cortex, protecting the deep sleep from disruption. In REM sleep, the thalamus behaves differently again. It reopens, but rather than forwarding signals from the external sense organs, it forwards signals generated within the brain itself. The internally generated patterns of neural activity, from the brainstem, from the limbic system, from the visual cortex's own spontaneous activity, are transmitted to the cortex as though they were external sensory signals. This is why the dream feels perceived rather than imagined. The insula, a region of cortex buried within the lateral sulcus of each hemisphere and associated with interoception, the sensing of the body's internal state, is active during REM sleep, and its activity appears to contribute to the bodily sensations of the dream, the feeling of movement, of temperature, of the physical texture of dream objects. The insula also plays a role in emotional awareness, in the sensing of what emotions feel like in the body, and its REM activation may contribute to the physical sensation of dreaming emotions, the cold weight of dream dread, the warmth of dream love, the racing heart sensation of dream urgency. The dream is not only visually hallucinated. It is bodily hallucinated, experienced with the full texture of physical sensation. Social dreaming, the tendency of dreams to be primarily about people and social situations, is consistent with the activity of the brain's social cognition networks in REM sleep. The temporoparietal junction, the medial prefrontal cortex, and the superior temporal sulcus, regions collectively involved in mentalizing, the understanding of other people's thoughts, feelings, and intentions, are active in REM sleep. The dreaming brain is simulating social situations and running simulations of what other people might be thinking and feeling, just as the waking brain does in social interaction. This may explain why dreams are so consistently social in character and why the social dynamics of dreams, the allegiances, the conflicts, the misunderstandings, the kindnesses, feel so emotionally weighty. The face-selective regions of the visual cortex, regions that in waking life respond specifically and strongly to human faces, are among the most consistently activated areas in REM sleep neuroimaging. The dreaming brain is extraordinarily face-rich. Dream reports consistently include more human faces than would be expected from a random sampling of the waking visual environment, and the faces are often highly specific, recognized individuals, familiar contexts, suggesting that face memory is one of the primary raw materials from which dream content is assembled. The amygdala's contribution to face processing, its sensitivity to facial emotional expression, particularly to threatening faces, may explain why dream faces are often emotionally charged, their expressions carrying weight in the dream's narrative. One of the most striking demonstrations of the dreaming brain's active state comes from studies of the visual cortex itself. In waking life, the primary visual cortex responds to light reaching the retina and to the simple features of visual scenes, edges, orientations, movements. In REM sleep, with no light entering the closed eyes, the visual cortex is nonetheless active, generating what researchers have described as an internally driven visual experience, activity patterns in V1, V2, and the higher visual areas that resemble, in statistical structure, the patterns produced by viewing real scenes. The brain is seeing, precisely, without anything to see. The visual system cannot tell the difference between a real scene and a dreamed one because both produce similar patterns of activity in the same neural circuits. It is remarkable. And tonight, it is preparing to begin. Chapter 3: REM Sleep. The discovery of REM sleep is one of the most important moments in the history of neuroscience, and it happened almost by accident, in a cramped sleep laboratory at the University of Chicago in 1952, watched by a graduate student who had been given an assignment that seemed, at first, entirely straightforward. Eugene Aserinsky was working in the laboratory of the sleep researcher Nathaniel Kleitman, a man who had spent decades studying the physiology of sleep and who remains one of the founding figures of modern sleep science. Kleitman gave Aserinsky the task of monitoring the eye movements of sleeping subjects, a mundane piece of observation that Kleitman believed would eventually confirm his hypothesis that the slow, rolling eye movements that occur at sleep onset stop entirely once the sleeper is deeply asleep. Aserinsky duly attached electrodes to his subjects, arranged himself in front of the monitoring equipment, and began to watch. What he saw did not match the hypothesis. In the early hours of the morning, the sleeping subjects showed bursts of rapid, jerking, coordinated eye movements quite unlike anything that had been described before, not the slow rolling movements of sleep onset, but something more urgent, more purposeful, something that looked almost like the eye movements of a person watching a scene unfold in front of them. The EEG at these moments also changed dramatically, shifting from the slow waves of deep sleep to a pattern resembling the fast, low-amplitude activity of waking. Aserinsky, uncertain whether he was observing something real or an equipment malfunction, woke the subjects during these episodes and asked them whether they had been dreaming. Almost all of them said yes. When he woke them outside these periods, from slow-wave sleep, most said they had not been dreaming, or could not remember. The connection between the rapid eye movements and dreaming was clear. The discovery was published in 1953, in the journal Science, under the title Regularly Occurring Periods of Eye Motility and Concomitant Phenomena During Sleep, a dry title for a paper that fundamentally changed our understanding of what sleep is and what the sleeping brain does. Kleitman and Aserinsky had found the dreaming state. They had shown that dreaming was not a random or occasional event, but a regular, recurring phase of every normal night of sleep, associated with specific, measurable physiological characteristics. Sleep, from that moment, was no longer a single undifferentiated state. The rapid eye movements themselves remain somewhat mysterious, even now. The most intuitive explanation, that they reflect the dreamer's gaze moving across the visual field of the dream, tracking the action as though watching a film, has been tested with mixed results. Some studies have found correlations between the direction of eye movements and the content of the dream as reported upon waking. In one striking experiment, a lucid dreamer was trained to signal their researchers with agreed eye movements while dreaming, a series of left-right signals that confirmed they were in a dream and had full awareness of it, and the eye movements were clearly visible on the monitoring equipment, demonstrating that the eye movements of REM sleep are under some degree of voluntary control even within the dream. Other studies have found less clear correspondence between gaze direction and dream content. The question of what precisely the eyes are doing during REM, and whether their movements are scanning a constructed visual scene or simply reflecting the neural activity that generates the visual experience, remains open. The physiological changes of REM sleep extend well beyond the eyes. The heart rate, which in slow-wave sleep is slow and regular, becomes variable in REM, speeding and slowing in response to the emotional content of the dream, just as the waking heart responds to real emotional experience. The breathing follows a similarly irregular pattern. Blood pressure fluctuates. In men, penile erections occur regularly throughout REM sleep, a phenomenon known as nocturnal penile tumescence, not related to sexual dream content but a consequence of the general autonomic activation of the REM state. In women, analogous genital vascular changes occur. The thermoregulatory system, the body's mechanism for maintaining core temperature, is essentially suspended in REM sleep, leaving the body at the mercy of the ambient temperature in a way that does not occur in NREM. The REM sleeper is, in some physiological respects, more exposed to the environment than the NREM sleeper, even as the dreaming mind is most deeply immersed in its interior world. The duration of REM periods increases across the night in a pattern that appears to reflect the underlying biological logic of sleep. The first REM period, occurring approximately 90 minutes after sleep onset, is typically brief, perhaps 5 to 10 minutes. The second is longer, perhaps 15 to 20. By the fourth and fifth cycles, in the hours before natural waking, REM periods may last 45 minutes to an hour. This elongation of REM toward morning is one of the reasons that the dreams people remember most vividly, and most often, are those from the final REM period, closest to waking. They are the longest, the most elaborate, the most recently experienced, and the most easily retrieved into waking memory before the dream-dissolving mechanism fully activates. The mechanism that makes dreams so difficult to remember is related to the neurochemistry of REM sleep, specifically, the suppression of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter involved in the consolidation and storage of memories, during the REM state. Without adequate norepinephrine, the experiences of the dream are not efficiently encoded into long-term memory. They exist vividly in the moment of the dream and in the brief period immediately after waking, during which the residual activity of the dream state can still be accessed, but they fade rapidly as the waking neurochemical environment is restored. Writing down a dream within minutes of waking substantially improves recall, not because writing is needed for encoding, but because the act of retrieval and articulation during that brief window transfers the content into a more stable memory trace before it disappears entirely. The regularity of REM sleep is maintained even under conditions of extreme sleep deprivation. When a person has been kept awake for many hours and finally allowed to sleep, the first few hours of recovery sleep are dominated by slow-wave sleep, the body prioritizing the deepest physiological rest. But as the slow-wave debt is repaid, REM rebounds with unusual intensity, longer, more frequent, more vivid. This phenomenon, called REM rebound, is consistent across species and across conditions, suggesting that the brain keeps a running account of its REM debt and presses to recover it when the opportunity arises. The dreaming is not optional. It is prioritized. The neurochemical switch that turns REM sleep on and off is one of the most precisely characterized mechanisms in all of sleep science. The key players are two populations of neurons in the brainstem, the REM-on neurons, concentrated in the laterodorsal tegmental nucleus and the pedunculopontine tegmental nucleus, which use acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter and are active during REM, and the REM-off neurons, concentrated in the dorsal raphe nucleus, the locus coeruleus, and the tuberomamillary nucleus, which use serotonin, norepinephrine, and histamine respectively and are active during waking and suppressed during REM. These two populations inhibit each other in a mutual inhibition circuit. When one is active, it suppresses the other, and vice versa, creating a bistable switch that can exist in either the REM on or the REM off state. The transition from one state to the other is driven by the accumulating pressure of the sleep cycle, the circadian rhythm, and the internal dynamics of the circuit itself. The selective suppression of REM sleep by monoaminergic antidepressants, drugs that increase the availability of serotonin and norepinephrine by blocking their reuptake, has important clinical and scientific implications. By tonically activating the REM off neurons through increased monoamine levels, these drugs suppress REM sleep, often dramatically. Patients taking selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors frequently report reduced dream recall and vivid dreaming, and polysomnography confirms that REM sleep is reduced in duration and altered in architecture. Whether the chronic suppression of REM sleep by antidepressants contributes to or detracts from the treatment of depression, given REM sleep's proposed role in emotional processing, is a question of ongoing debate. The clinical benefits of antidepressants are well established, and the REM suppression may even be part of their mechanism of action for some patients, but the long-term consequences of reduced REM sleep for memory, emotional regulation, and cognitive function remain an area of concern and active research. REM latency, the time from sleep onset to the first REM period, is a clinically significant measure. In healthy adults, REM latency is typically between 60 and 90 minutes. In severe depression, REM latency is often dramatically shortened. The first REM period may begin within 20 to 30 minutes of sleep onset, earlier than any of the slow-wave periods that normally precede it. This shortened REM latency is one of the most consistent biological markers of major depression and has been used in research as an objective correlate of the disorder, measurable in the sleep laboratory without relying on subjective report. The pathological shortening of REM latency in depression is thought to reflect the overactive cholinergic system that characterizes the depressed brain, the REM on switch being triggered prematurely, before the slow-wave sleep deficit has been adequately addressed. Across the lifespan, the proportion of sleep occupied by REM follows a remarkable trajectory. Premature infants spend as much as 80% of their sleep time in REM. Full-term newborns spend roughly 50%. The proportion declines steeply through infancy and early childhood, reaching adult levels of 20 to 25% by late childhood or early adolescence. This extraordinary predominance of REM in early development has led to theories, associated particularly with the neuroscientist J. Allen Hobson, that REM sleep in early life serves a critical function in the development of the nervous system itself, providing the internal stimulation necessary to drive the maturation of neural circuits in a brain that is not yet receiving adequate external sensory input. The fetus, in the womb, spends most of its sleeping time in a REM-like state, its brain being shaped by internally generated activity in the absence of the sensory experience that will later do the same work. The dream, in this view, is one of the oldest tools the developing brain has. The study of REM sleep has also illuminated some of the most perplexing aspects of mental health. Schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, PTSD, depression, and anxiety all show characteristic disturbances in REM architecture, some involving too much REM, some too little, some involving abnormal timing, content, or neurochemistry of the REM state. The precision with which REM sleep can be measured, characterized, and correlated with clinical outcomes makes it one of the most valuable windows into the brain's mental health. In the coming decades, as sleep measurement technology becomes less invasive and more accessible, as consumer wearables improve toward clinical-grade accuracy, the monitoring of REM sleep architecture may become a routine part of mental health assessment. The brain will dream tonight. It has already arranged to do so. Chapter 4: Memory Consolidation. The events of today are not yet permanent. They exist right now in a fragile, temporary form, patterns of neural activity, connections between neurons that have been newly strengthened by the experience of the past hours, held in the hippocampus in a state that is accessible but not yet fully consolidated into the durable long-term storage of the cortex. The hippocampus is, in neuroscientists' language, a temporary buffer, a structure of extraordinary capacity that can hold vast amounts of recent experience in a form that is quickly retrievable but also quickly lost if not processed further. For the experiences of today to become the memories of tomorrow, the month, the year, the decade, for them to join the stable architecture of what you know and who you are, the brain must do something with them tonight. That something is memory consolidation, and it happens primarily during sleep. The process was understood in broad outline long before the mechanisms were clear. Experiments comparing memory performance before and after sleep to memory performance over equivalent waking periods consistently showed that sleep produced greater retention, not merely because sleep prevented interference from new experiences, but because sleep actively improved memory, strengthening traces that had been weak at the time of learning. A student who sleeps after studying retains more than a student who remains awake for an equivalent period. A musician who sleeps after practicing a difficult passage performs it better the following morning. An athlete who sleeps after learning a new movement executes it more accurately the next day. Sleep, the research consistently shows, is not a passive gap between learning and performance. It is an active phase of the learning process itself. The mechanism most clearly established involves the hippocampus and the slow-wave sleep it occupies most fully. During waking learning, patterns of neural activity in the cortex and hippocampus encode the experience, the sensory details, the sequence of events, the spatial and temporal context, the associated emotions. The hippocampus acts as a binding structure, linking together the distributed cortical representations of different aspects of the experience into a coherent, retrievable memory. During subsequent slow-wave sleep, the hippocampus replays these patterns, reactivating the same sequences of neural firing that occurred during the original experience, but at a speed roughly 10 to 20 times faster than the original. These compressed replays, which appear as sharp-wave ripple events in hippocampal recordings, seem to serve the function of repeatedly driving the cortical networks that store the long-term representation, strengthening the connections that the original experience established. The evidence for hippocampal replay is remarkably direct. In a series of landmark experiments beginning in the 1990s, researchers at the University of Arizona led by Bruce McNaughton and Matthew Wilson implanted electrodes in the hippocampus of rats and recorded the firing patterns of individual neurons as the animals navigated a maze during the day. When the animals subsequently slept, the same neurons fired in the same sequences, the same patterns of activity, reactivating in the same order, in the same rat that had learned the maze. The brain was replaying the day's experience during sleep. In subsequent experiments, researchers have shown that the replay occurs preferentially during the sharp-wave ripple events of slow-wave sleep, that it correlates with the degree of subsequent memory retention, and that disrupting the sharp-wave ripples impairs memory consolidation for the experiences that had been learned before sleep. REM sleep contributes to memory consolidation in ways that are distinct from slow-wave sleep and may be complementary to it. Where slow-wave sleep appears to preferentially consolidate declarative memories, explicit, consciously accessible memories of facts and events, REM sleep appears to be particularly important for procedural and emotional learning, for the integration of new memories with existing knowledge, and for the creative recombination of information from different sources. The sleeping brain during REM does not simply replay today's experiences in isolation, it appears to find connections between today's experiences and older, seemingly unrelated memories, weaving them together in ways that can produce novel insights upon waking. This integrative function of REM sleep has been demonstrated in studies of creative problem solving. participants presented with a mathematical task that has a hidden shortcut, a rule that, if discovered, allows the problem to be solved much more quickly, are far more likely to discover the shortcut if they have had a night of sleep between initial learning and subsequent testing than if they have been tested after an equivalent waking period. The sleeping brain, it seems, looks for patterns and relationships that the waking analytical mind, focused on explicit strategies, tends to miss. The famous cases of creative insight occurring in dreams or at the moment of waking, Kekule's discovery of the ring structure of benzene after a dream of a snake eating its tail, the chemist Dmitry Mendeleev reportedly dreaming the arrangement of the periodic table, the composer Paul McCartney waking with the melody of Yesterday fully formed, may reflect this integrative function taken to its most extreme expression. The relationship between sleep and memory is not merely a matter of efficiency or performance on laboratory tasks. It bears on the deepest questions of identity and personhood. We are, in a very real sense, the sum of our memories, the accumulated record of experience that defines our relationships, our knowledge, our preferences, our fears, our sense of self in the world. The brain that consolidates those memories during sleep is not simply maintaining a filing system. It is actively constructing the person who will wake in the morning, editing, integrating, discarding some elements and strengthening others, weaving the experiences of one day into the fabric of an entire life. Sleep is not merely when the brain rests. It is, in part, when it does the deep work of becoming itself. Sleep spindles, those bursts of rapid cortical oscillation that characterize stage 2 NREM sleep, recurring approximately 15 times per minute throughout the night, appear to play a particularly specific role in memory consolidation. Spindles are generated by a loop between the thalamus and the cortex, and during each spindle, the cortical neurons that are most relevant to recently encoded memories are preferentially reactivated. The spindle creates a brief window of elevated cortical excitability, a moment when the synaptic connections relevant to a particular memory are especially primed for strengthening, and the hippocampal replays that occur during the sharp wave ripples between spindles appear to be timed to coincide with these windows. The hippocampus, in other words, is not just replaying memories randomly, it is synchronizing the replay with the moments when the cortex is most ready to receive and consolidate it. The precision of this coordination, the hippocampus and cortex working in concert, their activity locked by the sleep architecture, is one of the most elegant pieces of biological engineering in the sleeping brain. Targeted memory reactivation is a technique that exploits this synchrony for practical benefit. During learning, researchers associate a specific sensory cue, a distinctive sound, a particular odor, with the material being learned. During subsequent sleep, when the learner is in slow-wave sleep, the cue is played or presented at low intensity, not enough to wake them, but enough to reach the brain. Studies have consistently shown that the targeted presentation of the learning-associated cue during slow-wave sleep improves memory for the associated material, presumably by triggering preferential reactivation of the relevant hippocampal memory trace during the spindle ripple windows. The memory is, in a sense, called up from sleep and given an additional round of consolidation. The technique has been used to improve memory for vocabulary, for spatial layouts, for musical pieces, and for procedural tasks, with consistent and sometimes dramatic effects. Napping, even brief napping, produces measurable memory consolidation benefits. A 20 to 30-minute nap, primarily consisting of stage 2 NREM sleep and its associated spindle activity, has been shown to reverse the performance degradation that occurs across a day of repeated memory tasks. A longer nap of 60 to 90 minutes, long enough to include a period of slow-wave sleep, produces memory consolidation effects comparable in some measures to a full night of sleep for the material learned before the nap. Cultures with a tradition of daytime napping show different cognitive performance profiles across the day than those without. The post-lunch dip in alertness and performance that is familiar to most people may represent the body's natural inclination toward a brief sleep period in the early afternoon, aligned with a secondary circadian dip that occurs at approximately that time. The forgetting curve, the rapid decline in retention of new material over the hours following learning, first described by the German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus in the 1880s, flattens significantly when a sleep period intervenes. Ebbinghaus measured the rate at which memorized nonsense syllables were forgotten over intervals ranging from 20 minutes to 31 days, and found that forgetting was most rapid in the first hour and continued steeply for the first day. Modern studies that replicate this measurement with a sleep period between learning and testing find that the decay is substantially slower in the sleep condition. The forgetting curve is bent upward by sleep. What sleep is doing is not preventing forgetting entirely, but shifting the material from the rapidly decaying short-term trace of recent experience into the more stable, long-term trace of consolidated memory. The distinction between different types of memory, between the declarative memory of facts and events, the procedural memory of skills and sequences, the emotional memory of significant experiences, is reflected in which stages of sleep preferentially consolidate each type. Slow-wave sleep appears to preferentially benefit declarative memory, memories of facts, words, and events that can be consciously recalled and described. REM sleep appears to preferentially benefit procedural memory, the memory of skills, sequences, and patterns, and emotional memory. Some studies suggest that the optimal sleep for comprehensive memory consolidation involves both slow-wave sleep and subsequent REM sleep, the two stages working in sequence on different aspects of the same learning, slow-wave sleep transferring the explicit structure of what was learned, REM sleep integrating it with existing knowledge and reducing its emotional charge. The practical implications of sleep's role in memory consolidation extend to decisions about when to study, when to sleep, and when to be tested. Learning material immediately before sleep, rather than in the morning with a full day of waking life between learning and sleep, maximizes the overlap between the encoding of the material and the first consolidation opportunity. Sleeping immediately after learning prevents the retroactive interference that waking experience imposes on fresh memory traces. And testing oneself after sleep, rather than before, assesses the consolidated rather than the raw encoding, a more accurate measure of what has actually been learned. The curriculum of learning, if it took sleep science seriously, would look quite different from the curricula that most educational institutions currently offer. Sleep after learning is not a luxury. It is the second half of the learning. Chapter 5: Emotional Processing. Not all memory is equal. The memory of a fact, a name, a date, the formula for a chemical compound, is a relatively neutral thing, stored and retrieved according to its accuracy and its relevance, subject to the same processes of consolidation and decay as any other declarative memory. But the memory of an experience, particularly an emotionally significant experience, one that carried with it fear or grief or shame or loss or the particular acute pain of humiliation, is a different kind of thing entirely. It does not simply sit in storage. It carries its emotional charge with it, available for reactivation every time the memory is retrieved, capable of returning you, even years later, to something approaching the full physiological state of the original experience. The memory of an embarrassing moment can produce flushing and shame decades after it occurred. The memory of a loss can produce grief as fresh as the day it happened. This emotional weight is not merely a psychological inconvenience. It has a specific neural basis, rooted in the relationship between the amygdala and the hippocampus in the encoding and storage of emotionally charged experiences. The amygdala, the almond-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobe that processes emotional significance, particularly threat and fear, modulates the strength of hippocampal memory encoding during emotional experiences. When something emotionally significant happens, the amygdala releases signals that enhance the hippocampus's encoding of the experience, ensuring that emotionally significant events are remembered more strongly than neutral ones. This is adaptive. The memory of a near escape from danger is more valuable than the memory of a pleasant but unremarkable afternoon. But it means that the most painful experiences of a life are also, in general, the most indelibly recorded. The function of REM sleep in relation to emotional memory is one of the most clinically important areas of current sleep research, largely because of the work of the neuroscientist Matthew Walker at the University of California, Berkeley. Walker and his colleagues have developed and tested what Walker calls the overnight therapy hypothesis, the idea that REM sleep, through its specific neurochemical conditions, performs a kind of molecular uncoupling of the emotional tone from the memory content of difficult experiences. In waking life, the amygdala and hippocampus remain tightly coupled. When a painful memory is retrieved, the amygdala responds with something approximating the original emotional force. But during REM sleep, when the amygdala is active but the norepinephrine, the neurochemical that drives the stress response, is almost entirely absent, the brain can reactivate emotional memories without the corresponding physiological arousal. It processes the content without the pain. The evidence for this hypothesis comes from multiple directions. Participants who sleep after learning emotionally negative images show reduced amygdala response when viewing those images the following day, compared with participants who viewed the images in the morning and then stayed awake until evening. The waking brain, retrieving the memory over and over across the waking hours, reactivates the amygdala each time, maintaining or even amplifying the emotional charge. The sleeping brain, processing the same memory in the norepinephrine-free chemistry of REM, reduces it. Over multiple nights, the emotional weight of a difficult experience progressively lightens, not because the memory itself fades, but because the amygdala's response to it diminishes. You can remember what happened without feeling the full force of what it felt like at the time. This process is disrupted in post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and the disruption illuminates the mechanism with painful clarity. People with PTSD show abnormal REM sleep, elevated levels of norepinephrine during the REM state, preventing the norepinephrine-free processing that would normally allow emotional memories to be decoupled from their physiological charge. Instead of the memory being reactivated in a low-arousal chemical environment that gradually strips the emotional weight, it is reactivated in the presence of the very neurochemical that drives the stress response, potentially reinforcing the emotional charge rather than reducing it. The nightmare, the terrifying recurrence of the traumatic experience in sleep, is one of the hallmark symptoms of PTSD, and it may represent a catastrophic failure of the emotional processing function that REM sleep is supposed to provide. One of the pharmaceutical treatments showing promise in PTSD, prazosin, works by blocking the alpha-1 norepinephrine receptor, reducing the norepinephrine signaling that interferes with REM sleep's emotional processing function. By restoring the norepinephrine-free chemistry of normal REM sleep, prazosin reduces nightmares in some PTSD patients and may help to restore the overnight therapy function that the disorder has disrupted. The treatment is not universally effective, and the mechanisms are not perfectly understood, but the rationale is grounded in the neuroscience of REM sleep and emotional memory, a clinical intervention guided by an understanding of what the sleeping brain is supposed to be doing and what has gone wrong. The implications of the overnight therapy hypothesis extend beyond clinical conditions to the ordinary emotional life of anyone who sleeps. The difficult conversation of yesterday, the disappointment of last week, the slow grief of a loss that is months old, all of these are being processed during REM sleep, their emotional weight gradually reduced by the remarkable chemistry of the dreaming brain. The expression that time heals wounds may be more accurate when restated as sleep heals wounds. It is the accumulated hours of REM sleep across the weeks and months following a painful experience that progressively lightens its emotional burden, not the mere passage of time itself. Sleep-deprived people show greater emotional reactivity, worse regulation of negative emotion, and slower recovery from adversity. The sleeping brain is the brain's own therapist, and REM is the session. The specific brain regions involved in the overnight emotional processing have been characterized with increasing precision through neuroimaging studies. Functional MRI studies comparing brain responses to emotional images before and after sleep versus before and after an equivalent waking period, find that sleep specifically reduces the response of the amygdala to the emotional images while preserving or even slightly enhancing the response of the medial prefrontal cortex, the region associated with the cognitive regulation of emotion. This pattern, amygdala down, prefrontal up, is precisely the pattern associated with healthy emotional regulation, the amygdala detecting and responding to emotional salience, the prefrontal cortex providing the cognitive context that moderates the response. Sleep, in a sense, restores the ability to regulate emotion rather than merely to feel it. The emotionally exhausted, reactive state of the severely sleep-deprived person, in which every frustration feels disproportionate, every setback feels catastrophic, every emotional stimulus produces a response that the waking mind cannot adequately modulate, reflects the failure of this overnight restoration. Cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, plays a complex role in this emotional processing system. Cortisol is normally at its lowest concentration in the blood in the early hours of the night, when the first long slow-wave sleep periods occur, and rises to its daily peak in the early morning hours just before natural waking. This low cortisol, early night window coincides with the slow-wave sleep phases that perform the most physical restoration and provide the greatest growth hormone release. If cortisol remains chronically elevated, as it does in people experiencing prolonged stress, anxiety disorders, or the hyperarousal of PTSD, it disrupts slow-wave sleep, suppresses growth hormone, and may interfere with the emotional processing function of subsequent REM sleep. The stress hormone, by disrupting the architecture of sleep, perpetuates the emotional vulnerability that triggered the stress response in the first place. Emotional regulation the day after a poor night of sleep is measurably impaired in both laboratory and naturalistic studies. People who have slept poorly show elevated negative affect, reduced positive affect, greater emotional reactivity to stressors, and poorer performance on tasks requiring the suppression or redirection of emotional responses. The effect is dose-dependent. More sleep deprivation produces more severe emotional dysregulation, and it reverses with recovery sleep. Importantly, the emotional dysregulation of sleep deprivation is not simply the result of feeling tired and therefore having fewer cognitive resources for emotional management. It reflects specific changes in the activity of the prefrontal amygdala circuit. The prefrontal cortex's ability to modulate amygdala activity is directly impaired by sleep loss, in ways that parallel the impairment seen in anxiety disorders and depression. Sleep and the extinction of fear memories, the process by which a previously threatening stimulus loses its ability to trigger fear after repeated non-threatening exposure, is another area where sleep has been shown to play a facilitative role. In fear extinction therapy, the standard treatment for anxiety disorders and phobias, patients are repeatedly exposed to feared stimuli without the feared consequence, gradually reducing the conditioned fear response. Studies have shown that sleep following extinction training improves the consolidation of the extinction memory, the new, non-threatening association, making it more resistant to spontaneous recovery and to relapse. This suggests that sleep after cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety or PTSD may be an important factor in the long-term effectiveness of the treatment, and that disruptions to sleep during or after therapy may compromise the consolidation of therapeutic gains. The social consequences of emotional processing in sleep extend beyond individual well-being to the quality of relationships. Studies examining the association between sleep quality and social behavior find that well-rested people are more empathic, more accurate in reading facial emotional expressions, more willing to help others, and more positively regarded by social partners, compared with sleep-deprived individuals. The overnight emotional processing that reduces personal distress also appears to restore the social emotional attunement, the capacity to feel with and for other people, that makes human social life possible. A person who has slept poorly is not merely suffering themselves. They are, in measurable terms, a somewhat less generous and less perceptive social partner. The case for prioritizing sleep during periods of emotional difficulty, grief, relationship strain, acute stress, the aftermath of loss, is, in light of the neuroscience, stronger than the common cultural narrative suggests. The prevailing tendency when emotional distress makes sleep difficult is to regard the insomnia as a symptom of the underlying difficulty, to be addressed when the emotional situation resolves. But the research on overnight emotional processing suggests that the causal arrow runs in the other direction as well. The emotional situation is harder to resolve without adequate sleep, because the nightly processing that normally reduces the emotional charge of difficult experiences is being impaired by the insomnia itself. Protecting sleep during difficult times is not a luxury or an avoidance. It is one of the most direct and effective forms of emotional self-care available. The brain tends the heart while the body rests. Let it tend tonight. Chapter 6: The Default Mode Network. There is a network in the brain that was, for a long time, almost invisible to neuroscience, not because it was inactive, but because it was active at precisely the moments when researchers were not looking for activity. The default mode network, as it came to be called, comprises a distributed set of brain regions including the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the precuneus, the angular gyrus, and the hippocampal formation, regions spread across the cortex but connected by dense white matter tracts that allow them to function as a coordinated system. This network was first clearly characterized in the late 1990s, when neuroimaging researchers began to notice that certain brain regions consistently showed high activity when subjects were resting, not performing any assigned task, and systematically deactivated when subjects were given cognitive tasks to perform. The pattern was reproducible and consistent: the same regions always activated at rest, the same regions always deactivated during tasks. The pattern had a name: task-negative, resting state, and eventually, the default mode network. The initial interpretation was that these regions were simply the idling state of the brain, a kind of neural background noise, the activity of a system that was not yet given something productive to do. The task-negative label implied that the default mode was essentially doing nothing useful when the brain was not engaged in explicit cognitive work. This interpretation was wrong. As researchers looked more carefully at what subjects were actually doing during the resting state, asking them to report their thoughts at random intervals after scanning sessions, it became clear that the default mode network was not quiet at all. It was busy. The subjects were not simply resting. They were mind-wandering, thinking about the future, remembering the past, imagining hypothetical scenarios, thinking about other people and what they might be thinking and feeling, rehearsing upcoming conversations, planning events that might never occur, ruminating about things that had already happened. The default mode network is the neural substrate of the inner life, of all the mental activity that is not directed at an immediate external task. Mind-wandering, the wandering of thought through memory, imagination, and social simulation when the mind is not externally occupied, turns out to be one of the most frequent and characteristically human activities. Psychologists at Harvard, using an app that prompted subjects at random intervals to report their current thoughts, found that people were mind-wandering during approximately 47% of their waking hours, nearly half of conscious waking life. The default mode network was active during all of this wandering, and its activity correlated with the emotional quality of the wandering thoughts. When the default mode network is not well regulated, when it is chronically overactive or poorly coordinated, it is associated with rumination, depression, and anxiety. When it is well regulated, and its activity appropriately timed and coordinated, it appears to support the creative, imaginative, and socially sophisticated aspects of human cognition that make us, among other things, capable of narrative and of empathy. The relationship between the default mode network and dreaming is one of the most exciting frontiers in sleep neuroscience. Functional imaging studies of REM sleep have consistently found that the regions most active in REM overlap substantially with the regions of the default mode network: the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate, the precuneus, the hippocampal formation. The dreaming brain is, in neurological terms, a default mode brain. The same network that generates the mind-wandering of the resting-waking state, the inner narrative, the social simulation, the autobiographical memory retrieval, generates the dream. The dream is, in a sense, mind-wandering with the perceptual cortex fully engaged, the same free associative, self-referential, social and emotional content, but now accompanied by full visual and sensory hallucination rather than merely internal thought. This overlap has led some researchers to propose that the function of dreaming may be partly continuous with the function of mind-wandering, that both serve the purpose of consolidating autobiographical memory, simulating social scenarios, planning for future challenges, and exploring emotional material in a low-cost, offline mode that does not compete with immediate task demands. Where mind-wandering during the day processes recent events in a state of low external engagement, REM dreaming processes them in a state of zero external engagement, the brain fully decoupled from external input, free to pursue its associative work without interruption. The depth of the internal focus, and the completeness of the disconnection from the outside world, may allow the dreaming brain to do things that even undistracted waking thought cannot. The default mode network's activity during sleep also appears to be relevant to the problem of depression. People with depression show abnormal patterns of default mode network activity, typically excessive and poorly regulated activation of the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate, which underlies the ruminative, self-focused negative thinking that characterizes the disorder. Their REM sleep shows corresponding abnormalities: too much REM sleep early in the night, with an unusually long first REM period, and disrupted slow-wave sleep. Some researchers, including the sleep scientist Robert Stickgold, have proposed that in depression, the REM sleep that is supposed to process and resolve emotional material instead becomes a vehicle for extending and reinforcing the negative rumination of the waking default mode network, rather than reducing its emotional charge. The dream, in this model, can become a trap rather than a therapy, the mind returning to the same painful material night after night without the processing that would lighten it. Understanding how the default mode network transitions between its waking and dreaming modes, how the same neural infrastructure shifts from mind-wandering to full hallucinatory dreaming as the brain crosses into REM, is among the central questions of current dream science. The answer, when it arrives, is likely to illuminate not only the biology of sleep but the nature of consciousness itself, what it means for a system of neurons to have an inner life, and how that inner life becomes the dream. The default mode network was first named and characterized through a technical observation about what the brain does at rest, but the early interpretation of that observation was misleading in important ways. The standard approach in early fMRI research was to identify brain activity by contrasting a task condition with a baseline rest condition. Whatever was more active during the task than during rest was considered the neural correlate of the task. The implicit assumption was that the resting state was essentially inactive, a neutral background against which the task-related activity could be identified. What researchers began to notice, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, was that the rest condition was not neutral at all. The regions that constituted the default mode network were consistently more active during rest than during tasks, and consistently, reproducibly, across subjects and across different tasks. The baseline was not quiet. The baseline was itself a form of high activity, with its own neural signature. The discovery required a fundamental revision of how researchers thought about the resting brain. The anticorrelation between the default mode network and the task-positive networks, the frontoparietal networks of executive control and attention, is one of the most robust findings in neuroimaging. When the default mode network is most active, the task-positive networks are relatively suppressed, and vice versa. The brain toggles between these two modes, the internal, self-referential mode of the default mode network and the external, task-focus mode of the frontoparietal networks, as needed, allocating its resources between inner and outer engagement. The toggle is not instantaneous, it takes a few hundred milliseconds to switch between modes, and this brief delay may be one reason why very demanding external tasks can temporarily suppress mind-wandering almost entirely. The task-positive network keeps the default mode network suppressed for as long as the task demands it. The relationship between the default mode network and the sense of self, the continuous, narrative sense of being a particular person with a particular history, moving through time, is one of the most philosophically interesting aspects of its function. The medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, the two hubs of the default mode network, are consistently activated in tasks that require self-referential thinking, judging whether trait words apply to oneself, recalling personal memories, imagining the future self, considering what one wants or believes. Some researchers have proposed that the default mode network is the neural basis of the self, that the continuous, background hum of its activity during rest is the neural correlate of the ongoing sense of being a self, the narrative thread that connects past to present to imagined future. If so, dreaming, which activates the default mode network fully, may be one of the states in which the self is most thoroughly itself. In meditation practices that involve a sustained focus on a single object, the breath, a mantra, a visualized image, experienced practitioners show a suppression of default mode network activity compared with novice meditators and non-meditators. The suppression of the default mode network in sustained focused attention is associated with the reduction in mind wandering that meditators report, and with the associated changes in thought patterns, the reduction in rumination, the increase in present moment awareness. Long-term meditation practice appears to alter the connectivity and baseline activity of the default mode network in ways that persist beyond meditation sessions, potentially explaining some of the reported benefits of regular meditation practice for anxiety, depression, and emotional well-being. The same network that generates the dream is also the network that meditation learns to quiet. During NREM sleep, the default mode network shows a characteristic pattern of gradual deactivation, the same regions that are active during waking rest becoming progressively quieter as sleep deepens into slow-wave sleep. This deactivation is associated with the loss of conscious awareness that accompanies deep NREM sleep. The sleeper is not merely not responding to the external world, but is not having any reportable inner experience at all. The default mode network, which in waking generates the inner life, has gone offline. Then, as the brain transitions into REM, the default mode network reactivates, and with it, the inner life returns, now in the vivid, hallucinatory form of the dream. Consciousness returns to the sleeping brain not through the re-engagement of the external senses, but through the re-engagement of the internal network. The default mode network will be active tonight, in a form more thorough and more complete than any daytime mind-wandering can produce, freed entirely from the external world, engaged fully with the interior landscape of memory and emotion and imagination, generating the vivid, self-referential, socially saturated experience of the dream. It knows the way. It has traveled it every night of your life. The inner life continues while the outer world falls silent. Rest in it now. Chapter 7: Lucid Dreaming. Most of the time, the dream proceeds without any awareness that it is a dream. The dreamer is in it, experiencing it, feeling it, responding to it, without standing outside it. The uncritical acceptance of the dream's reality, which we traced in an earlier chapter to the deactivation of the prefrontal cortex, is total. A tiger may be chasing you through a corridor that opens into your grandmother's kitchen, and you accept this without question. A colleague appears in a setting where no colleague has any business being, and you do not pause to wonder. The dream presents itself as the world, and you inhabit it as such, because the part of the brain that would notice the inconsistency and object to it has gone quiet. But not always. Sometimes, in the middle of a dream, something shifts. A thought arises, not from within the dream's narrative, but from somewhere that stands slightly outside it. It is a thought about the dream, I am dreaming. The realization arrives with a quality unlike anything else in the dream, not as a spoken line, not as an event in the dream's story, but as a metacognitive recognition, a sudden awareness of the frame around the experience. You are still in the dream, the scene is still present, the visuals still vivid, the narrative still unfolding, but now you know that it is a dream. You are, simultaneously, inside the experience and aware that it is an experience. This is the state called lucid dreaming, and it has been known to dreamers, though not always by that name, for thousands of years. The Tibetan Buddhist practice of dream yoga, described in texts dating back at least to the 8th century, involves the cultivation of conscious awareness within the dream state as a spiritual practice, the dream being understood as an intermediate state of consciousness with particular properties for the exploration of the nature of mind. The Aristotelian corpus includes a brief but unmistakable description of the experience. Often when one is asleep, there is something in consciousness which declares that what then presents itself is but a dream. Saint Augustine, in the 5th century, recorded a letter describing a lucid dream experience by a physician named Gennadius. The Dutch psychiatrist Frederick van Eden, who coined the term lucid dream in 1913, kept a dream diary for many years and recorded more than 300 episodes of conscious dreaming, classifying them with the precision of a naturalist. What happens in the brain during a lucid dream? This question was essentially unanswerable before the development of a clever technique that emerged from the work of the British psychologist Keith Hearne in 1975 and was later used more systematically by the American researcher Stephen LaBerge and his colleagues at Stanford. The technique exploits the fact that the eye muscles, unlike the rest of the body's musculature, are not paralyzed during REM sleep. The rapid eye movements of REM are, after all, produced by the eye muscles contracting, and the signal can travel from the dreaming motor cortex to the eye muscles without being blocked by the REM atonia mechanism. If a dreamer can become lucid and then move their eyes in a specific, agreed pattern, say, 3 left-right movements, that signal will be visible in the eye movement recording. The dreamer can communicate from inside the dream. Using this technique, LaBerge and his colleagues were able to mark the onset of lucid dreaming precisely, allowing the brain's electrical activity during the lucid state to be characterized. The EEG recordings showed that lucid dreaming occurs during REM sleep. It is not a different state of sleep, or some liminal state between sleep and waking, but genuinely dreaming, the usual REM EEG present throughout. However, the gamma band activity, the fast oscillations in the 25 to 40 Hz range associated with higher cognitive function, binding of information, and consciousness, was significantly elevated in the lucid state compared with ordinary REM dreaming. Particularly notable was an increase in gamma activity in the frontal and frontoparietal regions, exactly the regions of the prefrontal cortex and the parietal association areas that are deactivated in ordinary dreaming. The lucid dream, it appeared, was a state in which the prefrontal cortex partially reactivated, restoring some degree of the self-referential awareness and logical function that ordinary dreaming suppresses. This frontal reactivation is not complete. The lucid dreamer does not regain the full rational function of the waking prefrontal cortex, the dream does not become logical, the scene does not become ordinary, the narrative does not follow the rules of physical reality. But the monitoring function returns, the metacognitive awareness that allows the dreamer to say, "I know that I am dreaming." This is a specific, narrow reactivation, the part of the prefrontal cortex that knows what the brain is doing, not the part that evaluates and controls what it does. Can lucid dreaming be trained? The evidence suggests that it can. Techniques including reality testing, regularly checking during waking life whether one is dreaming, by performing simple tests such as trying to push a finger through the palm of the other hand, looking at a clock twice to see whether the time remains stable, or trying to read text twice to see whether it stays consistent, are thought to build a cognitive habit of questioning reality that can, with practice, carry over into the dream state. Mnemonic induction of lucid dreams, or mild, involves setting a strong intention to recognize a dream before falling back to sleep during the night, and is one of the best supported techniques in controlled studies. The wake back to bed protocol, setting an alarm 5 to 6 hours into sleep, remaining awake briefly, and then returning to sleep, takes advantage of the concentration of long REM periods in the late night to increase the probability of lucid dreaming during the subsequent sleep. For some people, lucid dreams occur spontaneously and regularly. For others, they are rare or absent despite sincere attempts at cultivation. The capacity for lucid dreaming appears to vary substantially between individuals, perhaps reflecting differences in the baseline activity and connectivity of the prefrontal cortex, or in the individual's ability to maintain metacognitive awareness across the transition into REM. The history of systematic investigation into lucid dreaming reaches back to the 19th century. The French nobleman and writer Marquis de Hervé de Saint-Denis published a remarkable book in 1867, Dreams and How to Guide Them, based on his own meticulous dream diary maintained since the age of 13. By the time he published the book, Hervé de Saint-Denis had accumulated 22 years of dream records and had achieved a high level of facility with conscious awareness during dreaming, to the degree that he claimed to be able to direct the content of lucid dreams with some reliability. His book, which described both the phenomenology of lucid dreaming and the techniques he had developed to induce and prolong it, was initially published anonymously. The author was unwilling to be publicly identified with a topic then considered too close to the occult and largely ignored by the scientific community of his time. It was rediscovered more than a century later and is now regarded as a pioneering document in the scientific literature on dreaming. The stability of a lucid dream is a perennial problem for those who experience it. The recognition that one is dreaming, the metacognitive insight that arrives as a distinct cognitive event within the dream, is often followed almost immediately by waking, as the excitement of the recognition disrupts the neural state that produced it. Experienced lucid dreamers report a repertoire of techniques for stabilizing the dream state once lucidity is achieved, touching objects within the dream and attending closely to their tactile qualities, spinning the dream body rapidly, shouting instructions to the dream itself, such as increase lucidity or show me something interesting, focusing the eyes on a specific feature of the dream environment rather than looking around broadly. The common element of these techniques appears to be the maintenance of engagement with the dream's sensory content, keeping the visual and tactile inputs of the dream environment salient, preventing the reactivation of the waking state by occupying the dreaming brain fully. Once stable lucidity is achieved, what can a lucid dreamer do? The range of reported volitional control varies considerably between individuals and across different lucid dreams. Some report the ability to fly, to summon specific people or objects, to change the environment at will, to ask questions of dream characters and receive apparently informative responses. Others find that their control is partial and unreliable, that the dream has its own momentum and tends to reassert its narrative despite the lucid dreamer's intentions, that summoned objects appear in unexpected forms, that attempts to control the environment produce surprising rather than intended results. The dream, even in the lucid state, retains a degree of autonomy that most lucid dreamers find both frustrating and fascinating. The therapeutic application of lucid dreaming for PTSD nightmares is one of the most clinically promising areas of lucid dream research. If a person with recurrent trauma nightmares can learn to become lucid during the nightmare, to recognize, within the dream, that they are dreaming rather than reliving the traumatic event, they may be able to change the dream's outcome, remove themselves from the scenario, or reduce the fear response by the simple knowledge that it is a dream. Case reports and small studies suggest that this approach can be effective for some patients with chronic nightmares, reducing their frequency and intensity more rapidly than image rehearsal therapy alone. The challenge is teaching the lucidity induction to people whose dream states are already highly disrupted by the traumatic content and the associated sleep fragmentation. Recent research using shared lucid dreaming protocols, in which two lucid dreamers in the same laboratory simultaneously communicate with the researchers via agreed eye movement signals, has opened the possibility of studying the phenomenology of lucid dreaming in real time, as it happens, rather than only retrospectively from dream reports. Researchers at MIT, the Sorbonne, and several other institutions have begun to develop two-way communication protocols with lucid dreamers. Researchers ask questions in the waking world, and the lucid dreamer signals answers from within the dream using eye movements, then reports the full dream context upon waking. The results, still preliminary, suggest that lucid dreamers can accurately perceive and respond to simple mathematical and logical questions while fully immersed in a dream, their cognitive function within the lucid state being more sophisticated than it is in ordinary dreaming. Perhaps 5 to 10% of people experience lucid dreams regularly, more than once per month, without any deliberate effort to cultivate them. A larger proportion, perhaps 40 to 50%, have had at least one lucid dream in their lives. The capacity appears to be partly heritable, partly trainable, and associated with certain personality traits, particularly a disposition toward reflection, introspection, and metacognitive awareness in waking life. Those who regularly reflect on their own thought processes seem more likely to bring that reflective habit into the dream. For now, the ordinary dream is enough. The dream is coming, whether you watch it or not. Chapter 8 are nightmares. A nightmare is a dream that wakes you. That is the clinical distinction, not merely a dream with frightening content, which most people have without waking, but a dream of sufficient intensity or distress to break through the boundary of sleep and return the dreamer to wakefulness, heart accelerating, breath ragged, the images of the dream still vivid and present in the dark room. Nightmares are distinguished from night terrors, which are a different phenomenon occurring in slow-wave sleep rather than REM, episodes of extreme apparent fear, screaming, and agitation during which the sleeper cannot be easily woken and has no memory of any dream content upon eventual rousing. Night terrors are experiences without narrative. Nightmares are narratives that become unbearable. Most people have nightmares occasionally, perhaps once or twice a month in the general population, and occasional nightmares are considered a normal part of the range of human dream experience. Children have them more frequently than adults, which may reflect the greater demands of emotional and cognitive development in childhood, the greater proportion of sleep that children spend in REM, or simply the presence of fears, of darkness, of separation, of monsters, that are more vivid in childhood than they later become. Among adults, the frequency of nightmares increases sharply with anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, certain medications including some antidepressants and blood pressure drugs, and following stressful life events. Sleep deprivation increases nightmare frequency, partly through the REM rebound effect. The elongated, intensified REM periods of recovery sleep may produce more vivid and emotionally intense dream content. Why do we have nightmares at all? The evolutionary psychologist Antti Revontuo proposed the threat simulation theory of dreaming, which offers one influential answer. The theory proposes that dreaming evolved primarily as a biological defense mechanism, a simulation system that allows the mind to practice perceiving and responding to threatening situations in a safe, offline mode, without the real-world consequences of actual dangerous encounters. In ancestral environments, the most common threats were likely to involve predators, social conflict, physical danger, and natural hazards. A dreaming brain that repeatedly simulated these threats, generating scenarios of being chased, of confronting enemies, of navigating dangerous terrain, would, the theory proposes, produce a dreamer who was better prepared to respond effectively when real threats occurred. The nightmare, in this framework, is the threat simulation system operating at its most intense and immersive. The threat simulation theory receives some support from the observation that the content of nightmares, across cultures and across individuals, tends to cluster around a relatively small number of threat-relevant themes: being chased, falling, being attacked, being trapped, being in danger without being able to act effectively, losing someone important. These themes map reasonably well onto the kinds of threats that would have been most relevant in ancestral environments, and they are remarkably consistent across cultures, suggesting a partly universal rather than purely learned basis for nightmare content. the absence of modern threats, being in a car accident, failing an exam, receiving a medical diagnosis, from the most common nightmare themes, compared with the frequency of these experiences in modern waking life, has been cited as support for the evolutionary interpretation, though the universality of specific nightmare themes is contested. In post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares take a particularly vicious form. Unlike ordinary nightmares, which may be only loosely thematically related to the trauma that triggered the PTSD, trauma nightmares in many PTSD patients are repetitive and precisely replicative, the same scenario, or nearly the same, returning night after night with little variation, as though the brain is caught in a loop, unable to process the experience past the point of maximum terror. Where ordinary nightmare processing might gradually reduce the emotional charge of frightening dream content across successive nights, the same mechanism proposed for REM sleep's emotional processing function more generally. The elevated norepinephrine of the PTSD REM state prevents this reduction. Each recurrence of the nightmare reactivates the trauma memory in the same high-arousal chemical environment, potentially strengthening rather than weakening the traumatic association. The dream becomes the wound. Image rehearsal therapy is a cognitive technique that has shown genuine efficacy in reducing the frequency and intensity of PTSD nightmares. The technique involves having the patient recall the nightmare, rewrite its ending in waking life to produce a less threatening or more resolved version, and then mentally rehearse the rewritten version daily for several weeks. The effect appears to be a gradual replacement of the original nightmare narrative with the rehearsed alternative, the rehearsed, less threatening version becoming more accessible during sleep and gradually reducing the frequency of the original. The mechanism may involve the use of waking rehearsal to strengthen a competing cortical memory trace that successfully competes with the traumatic memory during the dream state, or it may involve a form of cognitive flexibility training that generalizes to the dream itself. Beyond PTSD, chronic nightmares affect roughly 4 to 8% of the general adult population, a frequency sufficient to cause significant distress and impaired sleep quality in many millions of people. The causes include not only trauma and anxiety but genetic factors. Twin studies suggest that the tendency toward frequent nightmares is partly heritable, and certain structural features of the dreaming brain, including heightened emotional reactivity in the amygdala and reduced prefrontal regulation of amygdala activity. Understanding nightmares more deeply is not merely an academic exercise. It is a clinical priority for a significant proportion of the population. Tonight, the brain is prepared for ordinary dreaming, the processing of the day's experiences, the consolidation of memory, the gentle exploration of the emotional material of a typical life. The nightmare is the exception, not the rule. The physiology of the nightmare awakening is distinctive and measurable. In the final moments of the nightmare, heart rate and respiratory rate typically accelerate, the dream's escalating threat producing the physiological arousal response appropriate to a real threat, driven by the amygdala's activation of the autonomic nervous system. The arousal may be preceded by a brief period of very intense REM activity, the eyes moving most rapidly just before the waking, the EEG showing the most activated pattern of the REM period. The awakening itself is associated with a surge of norepinephrine and cortisol that carries into the waking minutes, leaving the person genuinely physiologically activated even in a safe bedroom environment. The dream has ended, but the body is in a state appropriate to the threat the dream presented, and it takes several minutes, sometimes longer, for the activation to subside and the realization of safety to fully arrive in the nervous system. Nightmares across the lifespan show a developmental pattern with interesting implications. Children between approximately 3 and 8 years old have the highest reported frequency of nightmares of any age group, a period that corresponds to the development of a rich fantasy life and imaginative capacity but not yet the cognitive resources to fully contextualize fears within a realistic framework. The content of childhood nightmares typically involves monsters, threats from supernatural beings, and separation from caregivers, the fears that are most threatening at that developmental stage. Adolescents show a shift in nightmare content towards social fears, humiliation, rejection, failure, and threats to social status. Adult nightmare content shifts further toward threats involving the physical safety of the self and loved ones. The nightmare evolves with the dreamer, its content tracking what the developing mind most needs to process and rehearse. Nightmare disorder, a diagnosis applied when nightmares are sufficiently frequent and distressing to cause significant clinical impairment, is more prevalent than is commonly appreciated. Large epidemiological studies estimate the prevalence of chronic, distressing nightmares at between 4 and 8% of the adult population, with higher rates in women, in older adults, in people with psychiatric diagnoses, and in people who have experienced traumatic events. The clinical management of nightmare disorder has historically been limited to the treatment of the underlying condition, but evidence-based treatments aimed specifically at the nightmares themselves, image rehearsal therapy and, in some cases, medication with prazosin, are increasingly recognized as appropriate primary targets of intervention. The relationship between nightmares and creative productivity is an interesting counterpoint to their clinical significance. Many artists and writers have reported that nightmares have been direct sources of creative material. Mary Shelley began Frankenstein after a waking dream, likely hypnagogic, of a ghastly pale student kneeling beside a thing he had put together. Robert Louis Stevenson reported that the plot of Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde came to him in a dream that he initially described as a nightmare. Edgar Allan Poe's dark imagery was nourished, by his own account, by his often disturbed sleep. The nightmare, with its uninstructed access to the most extreme emotional and imaginative material, can produce raw content that the waking mind, with its self-censorship and conventional associations, would never generate. The terrible and the beautiful are closer neighbors in the sleeping mind than in the waking one. What should you do after a nightmare? The most important thing is to allow the activation to settle without either suppressing the experience entirely or ruminating on it at length. Brief writing or drawing, putting the content of the nightmare into an external form, can help to externalize the experience without reinforcing its emotional charge. Deliberately reorienting to the safety of the actual environment, the room, the light switch, the texture of the sheet, grounds the nervous system in present reality and accelerates the physiological recovery. If the nightmare is part of a recurring theme, working with the content through image rehearsal, rewriting the ending in waking life, can, over time, modify the recurring narrative. The nightmare is not an enemy. It is an indication that the emotional processing system is working hard on something important. Tonight, the architecture of sleep will carry the brain through its ordinary course, the slow-wave first half, the dream-rich second half, in the direction of a gentle morning. The dream tonight is unlikely to be a nightmare. Most dreams, across most nights, are not frightening or distressing, they are social, emotionally complex, sometimes strange, occasionally beautiful, occasionally tedious, very frequently concerned with the unresolved business of the recent past. The nightmare is the exception, the state of heightened dreaming that breaks through the threshold of sleep. The ordinary dream remains within it, contained and private, a small interior world that dissolves at waking without harm and leaves behind, at most, a residue of feeling and a few vivid images. The brain knows how to dream. And it knows how to come gently to morning. Chapter 9: The Body in Sleep. When you dream that you are running, your legs do not move. When you dream of reaching for something, your arm stays where it is. When the dream fills you with rage or terror, when the dream places you in a situation that would, if real, demand immediate physical action, the body remains still, the muscles unresponsive, the limbs inert. This is not a coincidence, not a fortunate limitation of the dreaming state. It is an active, dedicated physiological mechanism, precisely engineered to prevent the motor commands generated by the dreaming brain from reaching the muscles and producing real movement. The mechanism has a name, REM sleep atonia, sometimes called REM paralysis, and without it, every dreamer would act out every dream, turning every bed in the world into a nocturnal arena of thrashing, running, punching, and vocalization. The mechanism that produces REM atonia was characterized in detail by the neuroscientist Michel Jouvet and his colleagues in Lyon in the 1960s. Jouvet performed a series of experiments on cats in which he surgically lesioned the region of the brainstem responsible for generating atonia, the pera locus coeruleus, a small cluster of neurons adjacent to the locus coeruleus in the pons. The cats with these lesions appeared to dream while simultaneously acting out the dream. They would stand, walk, stalk imaginary prey, seem to respond to invisible threats, and display coordinated, apparently purposeful behaviors during what EEG recordings confirmed was REM sleep. They were dreaming and moving simultaneously, because the signal from the dreaming motor cortex that would normally be blocked before it reached the muscles was now allowed through. The observation was both scientifically illuminating and deeply poignant, the sleeping cats enacting a full interior life that was normally completely invisible. The same phenomenon occurs in humans, in a condition called REM sleep behavior disorder, or RBD. In this disorder, the atonia mechanism fails, partially or completely, and the sleeper acts out their dreams, sometimes with significant physical force. People with RBD punch, kick, shout, jump out of bed, and occasionally injure themselves or their bed partners during REM sleep episodes, all while genuinely asleep and experiencing the corresponding dream. They have no memory of the acting out upon waking, but they do remember the dream that drove it. A person with RBD who dreams of fighting may wake to find themselves on the floor with a bruised hand, having struck the bedside table. The disorder is more common in older men, and its presence is now recognized as a significant risk factor for the later development of neurodegenerative diseases, particularly Parkinson's disease, Lewy body dementia, and multiple system atrophy. The atonia failure appears to be an early symptom of the neurodegeneration in the brainstem that precedes the more recognizable symptoms of these conditions by decades. Sleep paralysis is the reciprocal phenomenon to REM sleep behavior disorder. Rather than the atonia mechanism failing and allowing movement, sleep paralysis occurs when the atonia of REM sleep persists briefly into waking, the sleeper regains consciousness but finds themselves unable to move, the muscles still held in the paralyzed state of the just departed REM period. The experience can last from a few seconds to several minutes and is often accompanied by vivid hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucinations, perceptions of presences in the room, of figures sitting on the chest, of sounds and sensations that are generated by the still partially dreaming brain and experienced as real despite the partially waking state. Sleep paralysis is not dangerous, the paralysis always resolves, the hallucinations always fade, but it can be intensely frightening, particularly for people experiencing it for the first time without any framework for understanding what is happening. The experience of sleep paralysis has been proposed as a cultural universal that underlies many traditions of supernatural visitation. The incubus of medieval European folklore, a demon that was said to sit on sleeping people's chests and produce a sensation of suffocating weight, matches the description of sleep paralysis with remarkable precision, the inability to move, the presence of a threatening figure, the feeling of oppressive weight on the chest, the terror. Similar traditions appear in cultures worldwide, the old hag of Newfoundland, the kanashibari of Japan, the jinn of Arab tradition, the pisadera of Brazil. The phenomenology is consistent across cultures because the neurological mechanism producing it is universal. Sleep paralysis, when experienced without a cultural framework to explain it, is interpreted through the most threatening available narrative, which, across human cultures, tends to involve supernatural beings. Beyond atonia, the body's relationship to the dreaming mind involves other changes that reflect the partial coupling between the dream-simulated experience and the body's physiological responses. Dreaming of an emotional confrontation raises the heart rate. Dreaming of cold produces skin temperature changes. Dreaming of physical pain occasionally produces real sensations of pain. Dreaming of sex can produce physiological arousal. The boundary between the simulated experience of the dream and the real physiological state of the body is permeable in both directions, the dream influences the body, and the body influences the dream. A person who is cold will more frequently dream of cold environments. A person with a full bladder will dream of water. The sleeping body is not sealed off from the dreaming mind, it sends its signals upward, and the dreaming brain incorporates them into the narrative. The body is never absent from the dream. It is the ground of it, the physical base from which the dreaming mind departs and to which it always returns. The paralyzed limbs, the racing heart, the rising and falling breath, they are the measure of the dream's intensity, the record of everything the sleeping mind is experiencing. And they hold the dreamer safe, the atonia mechanism faithful, the body still, while the mind travels wherever the dream takes it. The neuroscience of REM atonia has been elaborated considerably since Juvet's original work. The atonia is now understood to be produced by two concurrent mechanisms, an active inhibition of the motor neurons of the spinal cord, mediated by glycine and GABA released by neurons descending from the medullary reticular formation, and a suppression of the excitatory drive to those same motor neurons from higher motor centers. Both mechanisms must fail simultaneously, a relatively rare event, for REM sleep behavior disorder to occur. The glycinergic inhibition is particularly important, and genetic studies of families with unusual susceptibility to RBD have identified variants in the glycine receptor gene as a contributing factor in some cases. The atonia mechanism has been refined over hundreds of millions of years of evolution, and its occasional failure illuminates, through contrast, the extraordinary precision of its normal operation. REM sleep behavior disorder status as a prodromal marker of neurodegeneration, its appearance years or even decades before the clinical symptoms of Parkinson's disease or Lewy body dementia, has made it one of the most valuable windows into the early stages of these conditions. Studies following people with REM sleep behavior disorder over time have found that the probability of eventually developing a diagnosed neurodegenerative condition approaches 90% within 20 to 30 years of the RBD diagnosis. This relationship suggests that the mechanism producing the atonia failure is directly damaged by the same pathological process, the accumulation of Lewy body protein, particularly alpha-synuclein, that will eventually produce the motor and cognitive symptoms of the neurodegenerative disease. Identifying people in this long prodromal period, before the neurodegeneration has progressed far enough to produce recognizable clinical symptoms, creates an opportunity for neuroprotective intervention, if effective interventions can be developed. The body's relationship to the dreaming mind is also expressed in the way that ongoing bodily sensations influence dream content. Studies examining the relationship between physiological states during sleep and the content of reported dreams find consistent, if not overwhelming, correspondences. Full bladders produce water-related dream themes. Thirst produces dreams of drinking. Respiratory obstruction, as in mild sleep apnea, produces dreams of suffocation, drowning, or being in airless spaces. Being too warm produces dreams of warm, oppressive environments. Being too cold produces dreams of winter and cold exposure. The dreaming brain does not completely ignore the body, it receives interoceptive signals and incorporates them into the narrative, typically in a slightly displaced or metaphorical form that makes the body's state thematically present without producing a literal representation of the sensation. Blood pressure follows a characteristic pattern through the night that has important cardiovascular implications. In healthy individuals, blood pressure dips by 10 to 15% during NREM sleep, a pattern called dipping, and rises again in the early morning hours as the body prepares for the transition to wakefulness. This nocturnal dip is associated with reduced cardiovascular risk. The lower pressure during sleep reduces the mechanical stress on arterial walls and allows the cardiovascular system a period of relative rest. People who do not show the normal nocturnal dip, called non-dippers, have a higher risk of cardiovascular events, hypertension, and end organ damage. During REM sleep, the dip is partially reversed. Blood pressure and heart rate are more variable and somewhat elevated compared with NREM, reflecting the autonomic activation that accompanies the dream. The heart, in REM, is responding to the physiological demands of a life that does not exist. The skin during sleep tells its own story. Skin temperature rises through the early part of the night as the body's thermoregulation actively directs blood flow from the core to the periphery, a process that facilitates the fall in core body temperature that is one of the primary triggers of sleep. The warm, soft skin of a person in deep sleep is not merely pleasant to the touch, it is the surface expression of an active thermoregulatory process. In REM sleep, the normal thermoregulatory activity is suspended. The body becomes temporarily poikilothermic, regulating its temperature less actively and becoming more dependent on the ambient temperature of the environment. The bedding, the room temperature, and the presence of another warm body nearby all become more significant during REM than during NREM, influencing the body's thermal state in ways that can affect dream comfort and sleep continuity. The body and the dreaming mind are not separate systems running in parallel. They are one system in two modes, the body providing the physical substrate and the physiological context, the dreaming mind providing the narrative and the experience. What the body feels, the dream incorporates. What the dream demands, the body provides. They are in constant, silent conversation across the boundary of sleep, a conversation that has been ongoing in vertebrates for hundreds of millions of years, in the dark, in the warmth, in the still bodies of creatures who could not know they were dreaming and who dreamed regardless. The body keeps its vigil. The dreaming mind is free. Chapter 10: Animal Dreams. You are not the only creature in the world who dreams. The question of whether animals dream was, for most of the history of science, a philosophical rather than an empirical question, a matter of inference rather than evidence, colored by assumptions about consciousness, about the uniqueness of human inner experience, about whether animals have anything that could be called a subjective experience at all. The dominant tradition, shaped by Descartes' claim that animals are merely automata, was to answer no. Animals might display the physiological signs of REM sleep, but they could not be said to dream in any meaningful sense, because they lacked the interior life in which a dream could occur. This position has been steadily undermined, over the past several decades, by a combination of neurophysiological evidence that is difficult to explain in any other terms. The physiological signs of REM sleep, the desynchronized EEG, the rapid eye movements, the muscle atonia, the variable heart rate, are found in all mammals that have been carefully studied, and in birds. The proportion of sleep spent in REM varies substantially between species. Newborn humans spend roughly half their sleep time in REM, as do many other altricial species, while horses and other prey animals spend relatively little, but the state itself is found consistently across the warm-blooded vertebrates. Reptiles show some evidence of a REM-like state, though less clearly. Fish and insects show simpler states of reduced responsiveness that may or may not be analogous to sleep in the mammalian sense. What seems clear is that REM sleep, or something like it, is an ancient feature of vertebrate neurology, not a recent addition to human biology, but a property shared widely across the tree of life. The most direct evidence for animal dreaming, in the sense of neural replay of waking experience during sleep, comes from the experiments on rats already mentioned in the chapter on memory consolidation. The landmark experiments by Matthew Wilson and colleagues at MIT, which began in the late 1990s, recorded the activity of individual hippocampal neurons in rats as the animals ran through a maze during the day. During subsequent sleep, the same neurons fired in the same sequences. The rat's hippocampus was replaying the maze running experience with the same temporal structure as the original, but compressed in time. Whether this replay constitutes dreaming in the full phenomenological sense, whether there is something it is like to be the rat during this replay, whether the rat experiences the replayed maze as though it were real, is unknowable with current methods. But the neural activity is there, and it is the same activity that underlines the vivid visual and narrative experiences of human dreaming. Birds present a particularly interesting case for animal dreaming, partly because their sleep architecture is somewhat different from that of mammals. Zebra finches, small songbirds that learn their songs through imitation during a critical developmental period, show activity in their song control nuclei, the brain regions that generate the motor commands for song, during sleep. Recordings from sleeping zebra finches reveal that their song control neurons fire in the same sequences during sleep that they would use to produce specific songs while awake, but without the accompanying muscle activity. The bird's brain is singing the song in its sleep, running through the neural program without the output reaching the vocal apparatus, apparently practicing the song in a motor simulation during sleep. Whether this is dreaming in any experimental sense is again unknowable, but the neural activity is as analogous to human REM replay as any evidence we have from other species. Dogs, many people report, display clear signs of dreaming during sleep, twitching legs, muffled barks, movements of the facial muscles, growling, whimpering, behaviors that suggest the dog is experiencing something during sleep that drives motor and emotional responses. The brainstem mechanism that produces REM atonia in dogs is the same as in humans, but it is somewhat less complete in some individuals, allowing more of these residual movements to occur. Stanley Coren, a psychologist and dog expert who has written extensively about the inner lives of dogs, has suggested that smaller dogs tend to dream more frequently than larger ones, having shorter sleep cycles and therefore more frequent REM periods per night, and that puppies and older dogs seem to dream more than young adult dogs. Whether these inferences are precisely correct is difficult to establish, but the presence of REM sleep and the behaviors associated with it in dogs is not in doubt. The evolutionary question raised by the universality of REM sleep across mammals is significant. If dreaming serves important functions, memory consolidation, emotional processing, threat simulation, creative integration of experience, then the persistence of these functions across species suggests that they were present in the common ancestors of mammals and were sufficiently important to be maintained through hundreds of millions of years of evolution. The dreaming brain is not a recent addition to our ancestry. It is old, perhaps as old as the mammalian lineage itself, perhaps older. When you dream tonight, you are doing something that every warm-blooded creature sharing this planet does, something that the first mammals were doing as they huddled in the vegetation of the Mesozoic, something that the ancestors of every dog and every mouse and every whale and every bat and every sparrow and every sleeping thing in the world is doing in the dark beside you, each in its own interior landscape. One of the most surprising and recent discoveries in the neuroscience of sleep is that octopuses appear to experience something analogous to REM sleep, and that during this putative REM-like state, they undergo rapid changes in skin color and texture, flashing through patterns of light and dark, of yellow and brown, of mottled and striped, in sequences that resemble, in striking miniature, the color patterns the octopus displays in various behavioral contexts during waking. The implications of this observation are considerable. Octopuses are cephalopods. They diverged from the lineage that eventually produced vertebrates more than 500 million years ago, long before the common ancestor of fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals. If both octopuses and vertebrates show something functionally analogous to REM sleep, with associated neural replay and possibly something resembling dreaming, then the functional state is either extraordinarily ancient, predating the common ancestor of cephalopods and vertebrates, or has evolved independently in two very different lineages to serve similar functions. Neither possibility is simple. Fruit flies, Drosophila melanogaster, the tiny insects of genetics laboratories, show sleep-like states that, while entirely different in architecture from vertebrate sleep, display the hallmarks of genuine sleep: reduced responsiveness to stimuli, adoption of specific sleep postures, increased sleep drive following sleep deprivation, and impaired performance on learning tasks after sleep loss. The fact that even insects show sleep-like states, with their relatively simple nervous systems, their genomically well-characterized brains, their evolutionary distance from vertebrates, suggests that sleep serves functions so fundamental to neural computation that they have been conserved, or independently evolved, across virtually the entire animal kingdom. What those functions are, precisely, is still a subject of active investigation, but the ubiquity of sleep is one of the strongest arguments that sleep is not optional. It is essential. The platypus is a particularly remarkable case in the sleep literature. The platypus is a monotreme, one of the earliest branching lineages of mammals, separated from the placental mammals and marsupials for roughly 200 million years. Studies of platypus sleep in the 1990s found that the platypus spends substantially more time in REM sleep than any other mammal so far measured, up to 8 hours per day, during neonatal periods, of what appears to be REM sleep, with muscle twitching and rapid eye movements. In adults, the proportion remains high. One interpretation is that the platypus, as an ancient mammal with a brain organization quite different from modern placental mammals, has retained a more primitive form of sleep architecture in which the functions served by REM are distributed more broadly through the night. Another is that the platypus uses REM sleep for particularly intensive memory processing associated with its complex hunting behavior, the electroreception hunting of prey underwater, a sensory modality unlike anything in most other mammals. Whether different animals have subjectively different dream experiences, whether a dog's dream is phenomenologically different from a rat's dream or a bird's dream, is a question that current science cannot answer. What the brain of a sleeping dog is doing is, in terms of the neural mechanisms, broadly similar to what the brain of a sleeping human is doing, replaying the day's experiences, reinforcing memory traces, running the emotional processing circuits. Whether there is something it is like to be the dog doing this, whether the dog experiences its dreams as a phenomenological world that feels real, requires a theory of consciousness that we do not yet have. The evidence that the functional correlates of dreaming are present in dogs is strong. The evidence about the subjective experience is, by definition, inaccessible. What strikes the imagination, thinking about the sleeping world, is the sheer scale and variety of the dreaming that is happening right now. In every country, on every continent, in the forests and the oceans and the steppes and the cities, mammals and birds and perhaps other creatures are in REM sleep or some analog of it, their brains replaying, processing, simulating, constructing interior worlds from the material of their waking experience. The collective interiority of the sleeping world, if it could somehow be aggregated, would represent a landscape of experience so vast and so varied, the rat's maze, the bird's song, the whale's deep migration, the dog's afternoon walk, as to dwarf anything the waking world offers. All of it is happening in silence, in the dark, in the bodies of creatures who could not describe it if they wanted to. All of it is happening tonight, alongside you. The sleeping world, tonight, is vast. In every time zone, on every continent and in every ocean, warm-blooded creatures are sleeping, cycling through their stages, replaying their days, processing their emotional material, doing the interior work that waking cannot do. The cat in the corner, twitching its paws. The birds on the branch outside, their heads tucked under their wings, their song control nuclei running through the sequences of tomorrow's singing. The dog in another room, dreaming of the morning walk. And somewhere further away, in forests and savannas and seas, creatures whose interior lives are unknown to us, sleeping in the dark. The world sleeps together, in its different languages. And each of them is somewhere. Chapter 11, The History of Dreams. For most of human history, the dream was not understood as a product of the mind at all. It was understood as a visitation, a message arriving from outside the dreamer, from the gods, from the dead, from some other realm that was normally inaccessible to waking consciousness and that opened its borders in sleep. This understanding was not naive or pre-scientific in any simple sense. It was a reasonable inference from the phenomenology of the experience. The dream presents itself as something that happens to you, not as something you produce. Its content is often surprising, disturbing, or wiser than the dreamer believes themselves to be. It features people and places that the waking mind cannot simply summon by an act of will. The external origin theory of dreaming explains these features elegantly, and it dominated the interpretation of dreams in virtually every culture that left records. The ancient Egyptians had an elaborate theology of dreaming. They believed that the soul could leave the body during sleep and travel to other realms, encountering gods, spirits of the dead, and prophetic images of future events. Dream temples, sanctuaries dedicated to the god Serapis, and later to Imhotep, the deified architect and physician, were places where priests and seekers would sleep in hope of receiving a healing or prophetic dream. The practice of incubation, sleeping in a sacred space for the purpose of receiving a divine dream, was widespread across the ancient Mediterranean world, at the sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidaurus in Greece, at the temples of Isis in Egypt, at the oracle at Delphi. The seeker would purify themselves, perform the required rituals, and lie down in the inner precinct, and whatever they dreamed was interpreted by the resident priests as the god's response to their question. The ancient Greeks also produced the first attempts at a more naturalistic account of dreaming. Aristotle, in the 4th century BCE, wrote 3 essays on sleep and dreaming that are remarkably empirical in their approach. He considered and rejected the divine origin theory, noting that animals dream, and if animals dream, it seems unreasonable to claim that the gods are communicating specifically with animals, and proposing instead that dreams are produced by the lingering effects of waking perception, particularly of strong sensory impressions, persisting into sleep and generating experience without external input. He also noted, with what feels like a modern insight, that the dream often appears more vivid and intense than the waking experience it echoes, and that this intensification is itself a property of the sleeping mind. Sigmund Freud's interpretation of dreams, published in 1899, is probably the most influential single text on the subject ever written, and it created the framework within which dreaming was understood, both academically and popularly, for most of the 20th century. Freud proposed that the dream was the royal road to the unconscious, a carefully disguised communication from the unconscious mind to itself, in which unconscious wishes, particularly sexual and aggressive impulses deemed unacceptable to the waking ego, were expressed in symbolic form, transformed by the dream work, the processes of condensation, displacement, and secondary revision, into a manifest content that concealed the latent content beneath a layer of symbolism. To understand the dream, Freud argued, was to decode the symbols and recover the hidden wish. Freud's theory was enormously influential and enormously difficult to test scientifically. It made specific predictions, that the content of dreams would reflect unconscious wishes, that specific symbols would reliably represent specific unconscious material, that dream interpretation would reveal clinically significant psychological content, that proved difficult to confirm or refute by any agreed empirical method. The theory was also deeply embedded in the cultural assumptions of late 19th century Vienna, and many of its specific claims about the sexual significance of particular dream symbols, about the universality of certain Oedipal conflicts, have not survived cultural or scientific scrutiny. The discovery of REM sleep in 1953 by Asarinsky and Kleitman fundamentally reoriented dream science. For the first time, dreams could be studied empirically, subjects could be woken during REM sleep and their dream reports collected systematically, allowing the content, frequency, and phenomenology of dreaming to be studied with the tools of scientific psychology rather than clinical interpretation. The systematic study of dream content that followed, particularly the work of Calvin Hall and Robert van der Castle, who collected and analyzed thousands of dream reports across decades and cultures, produced a very different picture of dreaming than Freud's theory predicted. Dreams, the data showed, were not primarily expressions of hidden sexual wishes. They were predominantly social, emotional, and autobiographical, concerned with people the dreamer knew, with situations from their recent life, with emotional themes reflecting their current concerns. The most common emotions in dreams were not desire but anxiety. The most common scenarios were not wish fulfillment but problem solving, social navigation, and threat response. Contemporary dream science, shaped by neuroimaging and by the neuroscientific understanding of REM sleep, has largely abandoned the Freudian framework in favor of a functional account, the dream is not a disguised wish but a simulation, a biological mechanism for memory processing, emotional regulation, creative integration, and threat rehearsal, generated by the neural circuitry of the default mode network and the limbic system during REM sleep, shaped by the contents of the dreamer's memory. An emotional life, and interpreted through the same cognitive processes that interpret waking experience. The dream is the brain doing its work, not sending a message. It is process, not communication. And yet the dream remains strange, stranger, in some ways, than the theories built to explain it. The extraordinary vividness, the uncanny combinations, the emotional intensity, the persistence of certain images and themes across a lifetime, the occasional experience of a dream that seems to carry genuine insight or to prefigure events in ways that resist any simple explanation, these qualities continue to exceed what any current scientific account fully captures. The Islamic tradition of dream interpretation is among the most sophisticated and systematic developed before the modern era. The 9th century scholar Muhammad ibn Sirin produced a comprehensive dictionary of dream symbols and their interpretations, a work that became one of the most widely read texts in the medieval Islamic world and that continues to be consulted in parts of the Islamic world today. Ibn Sirin's approach was nuanced in ways that modern readers might not expect. He insisted that the meaning of a dream symbol depended heavily on the character, circumstances, and state of the dreamer, that no symbol had a fixed meaning independent of context, and that the same dream could mean different things for different people. Dreams, for Ibn Sirin, were not simply codes to be mechanically decoded but communications that required wisdom and knowledge of the dreamer to interpret correctly. This contextual sensitivity has more in common with modern psychological approaches than with the simple symbol dictionary approach of many later popularizers. Carl Jung, who had studied under Freud but diverged sharply from his mentor in the early 1910s, proposed a theory of dreaming that placed less emphasis on the personal unconscious and more on what he called the collective unconscious, a deeper layer of the psyche, shared across humanity, that expressed itself through universal symbols and motifs, which he called archetypes. The shadow, the anima and animus, the wise old man, the great mother, these recurring dream figures, Jung proposed, were not simply personal projections but expressions of universal human experiences, encoded in the structure of the psyche across evolutionary time. Dream interpretation, for Jung, required understanding both the personal associations of the dreamer and the archetypal patterns that the dream might be expressing. Jung's model has not fared well as a scientific hypothesis. The evidence for specific universal archetypes is limited and contested, but as a cultural and therapeutic framework, it has been deeply influential. The activation synthesis model proposed by Harvard psychiatrists J. Allen Hobson and Robert McCarley in 1977 was the first major scientific counter-theory to the Freudian tradition, and it was deliberately provocative in its claims. Hobson and McCarley proposed that REM sleep was characterized by the random activation of the brainstem, which sent waves of essentially random electrical signals upward to the cortex. The cortex, attempting to make sense of these random signals in the same way it makes sense of coherent sensory information during waking, synthesized a narrative, the dream, that was the brain's best attempt to construct a story from disordered input. In this model, the dream had no latent meaning. It was not a disguised wish or a message or a simulation. It was confabulation, the brain telling a story to explain inputs that were actually random noise. The emotional and narrative qualities of the dream were products of the synthesis process, not indicators of underlying psychological significance. The activation synthesis model was influential and generated extensive research, but it has been significantly revised in the decades since its original formulation. The signals from the brainstem during REM are not, in fact, random. They are structured, patterned, and preferentially activate regions associated with emotion, memory, and social cognition. The narratives produced by the dreaming brain are not random confabulation. They are consistent with the dreamer's waking concerns, their recent emotional experiences, and their personal history. Hobson himself substantially revised his views in later work, acknowledging that the dreaming brain is not simply synthesizing noise but is using the structured inputs of REM neural activation to construct experiences that are both personally meaningful and functionally significant. The most current scientific models of dreaming, the default mode framework, the emotional processing hypothesis, the threat simulation theory, the memory integration perspective, are not so much competing as complementary. Each captures an aspect of what the dreaming brain is doing: the default mode network generating the inner narrative, the emotional processing circuits reducing the charge of difficult experiences, the threat simulation system rehearsing responses to danger, the hippocampal cortical dialogue integrating new memories with old ones. The dream is all of these things simultaneously, a complex, multifunctional event that serves no single purpose but many, each of which is important, none of which fully explains the dream's most striking qualities. What science has not explained, what perhaps it cannot explain with current tools, is the quality of the dream experience, why it feels so real, why its emotional register is so intense, why certain dream images persist in memory for years or decades while entire waking months are forgotten, why the dream seems to know things about us that we have not consciously acknowledged. These qualities may eventually yield to explanation. But they may also represent something about the nature of consciousness that requires a different kind of understanding than the neuroscience of neural circuits and neurotransmitters can provide. The dream remains its own country. Sleep and travel there. Chapter 12: The Waking Edge. There is a country between waking and sleep that has no clear border, no customs post, no moment of crossing. You approach it without knowing you are approaching. The first signs are subtle, a loosening of the ordinarily tight association between thoughts, so that one thought leads not to the next logically but to something adjacent, something thematically connected in a way that feels meaningful but does not follow the usual rules of reasoning. The thoughts become images, not the deliberately visualized images of the waking mind, which require effort and intention and are recognizably constructed, but images that appear spontaneously, without being summoned, vivid and specific and completely unbidden. A face. A color. A fragment of scene. A word. The sequence is not narrative but associative, one image suggesting the next through resemblance or emotional resonance rather than logical connection. This is hypnagogia, the border country between waking and sleep, and almost everyone experiences some version of it on the way to sleep each night, though few are awake enough at the time to pay it close attention. The term hypnagogia was coined by the French psychologist Alfred Maury in the mid-19th century, from the Greek words for sleep and guide or leader. Maury was himself a prolific self-observer. He kept meticulous records of his own hypnagogic experiences over many years and noted their frequency, their content, and their relationship to the material of his subsequent full dreams. He found that the hypnagogic images were often continuous with the content of his later dreams, as though the imagery that began to generate itself in the hypnagogic state persisted and developed throughout the night's dreaming. Later researchers have confirmed that the hypnagogic state is, neurologically, a genuine transitional state, neither waking nor sleep, but characterized by a specific EEG signature that includes the theta waves of stage 1 sleep alongside residual alpha waves of relaxed waking, with occasional bursts of gamma activity that may reflect the brief, vivid micro-experiences that characterize the state. The content of hypnagogic imagery tends to share certain qualities that distinguish it from ordinary waking thought. The images appear with a quality of being perceived rather than imagined. They have the phenomenological status of hallucinations, arising with a sense of external presence even though they are clearly internal in origin. They are typically more vivid in detail than deliberately visualized images, yet less coherent in narrative than waking thought. They often have an abstract or geometric quality, patterns, colors, tessellating shapes, as well as the more recognizable imagery of faces, places, and objects. Voices are sometimes heard, a name spoken clearly, a phrase, a sentence that seems to arrive from outside the mind. The hypnagogic state is one of the most consistently reported contexts for the experience of hearing one's name called when no one is present. The hypnopompic state, its counterpart, experienced on waking from sleep rather than on entering it, has a somewhat different character. Where hypnagogic imagery tends to be abstract and kaleidoscopic, hypnopompic imagery is more often directly continuous with the dream just left, fragments of the dream persisting briefly into waking consciousness, the dream world not yet fully dissolved, its images hanging in the newly waking mind like the last vapor of smoke in a room after a fire has been extinguished. This is the state in which dreams are most accessible to memory, the brief window between the full dream and full waking in which, if the dreamer moves into consciousness gently and does not leap immediately into the demands of the day, the dream can be recalled. The hypnopompic state is, for anyone interested in their dreams, the most important moment of the night. Both hypnagogia and hypnopompia have been associated with creative insight throughout recorded history. Many of the most celebrated examples of creative breakthrough occurring at the edge of sleep belong to one or the other of these states. Thomas Edison, who famously resisted long periods of sleep and took brief naps throughout the day, reportedly held steel balls in his hands as he dozed, so that when he began to fall asleep and his grip relaxed, the balls would drop into metal pans on the floor, waking him, at the hypnagogic moment, and allowing him to capture whatever imagery or insight had begun to form in the transitional state. Salvador Dali practiced a version of the same technique with a key and a plate. Whether these accounts are entirely accurate is uncertain, but the principle they embody, that the hypnagogic state, with its uninstructed, loosely associative imagery, is a valuable source of creative material, is consistent with what neuroimaging and EEG research have found about the state's neural properties. The waking edge works in both directions. The brain preparing to cross from waking into sleep and the brain crossing back from sleep into waking are navigating the same country, from opposite directions. In both directions, the traversal involves a loosening of the prefrontal cortex's tight regulation of thought, an increase in the activity of the default mode network, a shift from directed, externally oriented cognition to the freely associative, internally generated cognition of the dreaming mode. This loosening is not a failure of the brain but its adaptation, the appropriate mode for crossing the border between the waking world and the sleeping one. You are crossing that border now, or approaching it. The thoughts that are accompanying these words are, perhaps, already beginning to lose their usual linearity. They drift. They suggest rather than conclude. They lead somewhere unexpected. This is not confusion. This is the waking edge, the beginning of the transition, the brain beginning to let go of the executive mode in which it spends its days and moving toward the interior, associative, simulative mode in which it will spend the night. The brain waves of hypnagogia, when measured with the EEG, show a characteristic signature that distinguishes the state from both relaxed waking and established sleep. Alpha waves, the slow, regular oscillations of 10 cycles per second that characterize relaxed, eyes-closed wakefulness, predominate at the very edge of sleep, giving the state a distinctive dreamy quality of relaxed but present awareness. As the hypnagogic state deepens, theta waves emerge, 4 to 8 cycles per second, associated with drowsiness and the beginning of sleep, and the alpha activity becomes intermittent, appearing in bursts rather than continuously. The EEG at this point looks like neither waking nor sleep but a blending of both, a transitional signature that is as characteristic of the hypnagogic state as the delta waves are of deep sleep. Occasionally, during particularly vivid hypnagogic images, there are brief bursts of gamma activity, the fast oscillations associated with active cognitive processing and perhaps with the binding of perceptual features into a coherent experience. The hypnagogic image is not passive. The brain is working to generate it. The catalogue of creative and scientific insights that have emerged from the hypnagogic state is remarkable. Auguste K. Coulet reported that the ring structure of benzene, one of the most important insights in the history of organic chemistry, came to him in a half-waking vision of a snake biting its own tail, a classical symbol that his drowsing mind spontaneously generated. Nikola Tesla, the electrical engineer and inventor, described a state between waking and sleep in which technical solutions would present themselves fully formed, visual and complete, needing only to be transferred to paper. The mathematician Henri Poincaré described the moment of mathematical insight arriving at the threshold of wakefulness, during a period of rest. The common element in these accounts is the same, the relaxation of the directed, analytical mode of thought that characterizes focused waking work, replaced by the freely associative, unconstrained cognition of the hypnagogic state, in which remote and unexpected connections between concepts can be made without the editorial intervention of the prefrontal cortex. Microsleeps, very brief episodes of sleep, lasting from a second to a few seconds, can occur during the hypnagogic period without the person being aware of them. The EEG shows a clear sleep signature for a moment, then the person returns to the hypnagogic state as though nothing had happened. During the microsleep, the person may have had a brief, vivid experience that is later recalled as part of the hypnagogic sequence, without any awareness that a genuine sleep episode had occurred. At the other end of the sleep period, during hypnopompia, similar micro-awakenings may occur within the dream state, brief returns to something close to waking awareness during the final REM period, during which the dreamer may have partial awareness of their actual environment even while the dream continues. The boundaries of the sleeping and waking states are more permeable than they appear from either side. What determines whether a dream is remembered on waking? The key factor appears to be whether the dreamer wakes during or immediately after a REM period, or significantly later. If the waking follows closely on a REM period, as it typically does during the early morning REM periods, which are the longest of the night, the dream content is still active in the brain's short-term memory trace and can be retrieved. If the waking follows a transition to NREM sleep after the REM period, even briefly, the dream trace is typically lost. The NREM sleep state is incompatible with the maintenance of the vivid, episodic quality of the REM dream memory. This explains why alarm clocks set for specific times produce such variable dream recall. An alarm that catches the waking edge of a REM period will produce a vivid, rich dream memory, while an alarm that sounds mid-NREM may produce nothing at all from a night full of dreaming. The slow return from sleep, the gradual emergence from the deepest sleeping state through lighter sleep into waking, is not merely a temporal transition. It is a neural one, the prefrontal cortex coming back online, the cholinergic system withdrawing, the monomenergic systems of serotonin and norepinephrine returning to their waking activity levels. This return takes time, and in the minutes immediately following waking, the brain is in a transitional state, more creative, more loosely associative, more capable of novel connections than the fully woken brain, that can be productively exploited by anyone who resists the urge to immediately engage with their phone or their day and instead lingers for a few minutes in the soft territory between sleep and full waking. But tonight, there is no need to plan for the waking. Tonight, the transition is in the other direction, deeper, not shallower. The edge you are approaching is not the one that leads back to the day but the one that leads forward into sleep. The images that arrive now, if they are arriving, are the beginning of the journey inward. The thoughts that are no longer following their usual logic are the first sign that the logic is releasing its grip. Let the thoughts drift now. Let the images come unbidden. The dream is very close. Closing, what your brain does while you dream. The brain is ready. It has been preparing all evening, down-regulating the prefrontal cortex, building its sleep pressure, cycling through its first passages of slow-wave sleep, repairing and restoring the body, replaying the day in compressed flashes in the hippocampus. And now, as the night deepens and the cycles turn, it is moving toward the dreaming hours, the long REM periods of the late night, when the visual cortex will ignite, the amygdala will lend its emotional color, the default mode network will generate its interior worlds. You do not need to do anything for this. You do not need to try to dream, or to remember the dream, or to guide it in any direction. The brain will do what it does, what it has done every night of your life, What every warm-blooded creature does in the dark hours of the world, what something very like it has been doing since before mammals existed. It will process what needs processing. It will consolidate what needs keeping. It will lighten what needs to be lighter by morning. Let the thoughts go now. Let the images come. The dream is waiting just past the edge of this last waking moment, patient, vivid, already forming from the material of your life and your memory and your deepest, quietest wishes. You can cross into it now. Sleep well. The brain knows the way.